What can you really know? Not what you believe, not what you hope, not what feels right. What can you actually know? This question sits at the foundation of everything. Before you can ask whether God exists, you must first ask what it means to know anything at all. Before you can declare what is morally right, you must ask how you could know such a thing. Before you can trust your senses, your memories, or your reasoning, you must ask whether these tools can deliver genuine knowledge or merely comfortable illusions. This is epistemology. The term comes from the Greek words episteme, meaning knowledge, and logos, meaning study or reason. It is the philosophical investigation into the nature, origins, and limits of human knowledge. But epistemology is not merely academic wordplay. It determines how you live. Right now, you trust that the ground beneath you is solid. You believe the food you ate yesterday will nourish you today. You accept that other minds exist beyond your own. Yet skeptics throughout history have shown that none of these beliefs can be proven with absolute certainty. You might be a brain in a vat, fed electrical signals by scientists. You might be dreaming this very moment. The entire universe might have popped into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with false memories. These are not silly thought experiments. They reveal something profound. Most of what you think you know rests on assumptions you cannot prove. And this matters. When a scientist claims to have discovered a new particle, when a court convicts someone of murder, when you decide to trust a friend, knowledge claims are being made. Epistemology asks, what makes these claims legitimate? What separates knowledge from mere opinion, from lucky guesses, from comfortable delusions? For over 2,000 years, philosophers have wrestled with these questions. Plato wondered whether knowledge could be more than mere true belief. Descartes tried to rebuild all knowledge on foundations that could not be doubted. Hume argued that much of what we call knowledge cannot be rationally justified. Modern epistemologists have developed increasingly sophisticated theories, yet fundamental disagreements persist. This exploration will take you through the entire landscape of epistemological thought. We will examine what knowledge is, where it comes from, how it is structured, and where it fails. We will look at the major theories that attempt to explain knowledge and the devastating critiques that have challenged each theory. We will investigate how knowledge works in practice, in science, in courts of law, in everyday life. And we will confront the possibility that genuine knowledge might be impossible after all. What follows is not a history lesson or an abstract game. It is an investigation into the foundations of everything you believe. By the end, you will understand not just what epistemologists say, but why these questions matter and how the answers shape your understanding of reality itself. Part 1. The central question: what is knowledge? Before we can explore theories of knowledge, we must understand what philosophers mean when they use the word knowledge. In ordinary conversation, people use the word loosely. Someone says they know their team will win, they know their partner loves them, they know it will rain tomorrow. But do they really know these things? Or do they merely believe them with confidence? Philosophers recognize several distinct types of knowledge. There is knowledge of how to do something, called procedural knowledge. You know how to ride a bicycle, how to swim, how to speak your native language. This differs from propositional knowledge, which is knowledge that something is the case. You know that Paris is in France, that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, that you are reading these words right now. There is also knowledge by acquaintance. a direct familiarity with something. You know your mother. You know the taste of chocolate. You know what pain feels like. Epistemology focuses primarily on propositional knowledge, knowledge expressible in statements that can be true or false. When we ask what knowledge is, we are asking what must be true for someone to genuinely know that a particular proposition is correct. The traditional answer traces back over 2,000 years to Plato. In his dialogue Theaetetus, Plato examined whether knowledge could simply be perception or true belief, ultimately suggesting that knowledge is justified true belief. This idea dominated Western philosophy for centuries and provides the starting point for modern epistemology. According to the traditional definition, 3 conditions must be met for you to know something. First, you must believe it. If you do not believe that it is raining, you cannot know it is raining. Belief is the mental state of accepting a proposition as true. Second, the proposition must actually be true. You cannot know something false. If you believe your car is parked on Main Street, but it was actually towed to a different location, you do not know where your car is, regardless of your confidence. Third, your belief must be justified. You must have good reasons or evidence for your belief. A lucky guess does not count as knowledge, even if it happens to be correct. Consider an example. Imagine you believe there is coffee in your kitchen. For this to count as knowledge, 3 things must be true. You must actually believe it, which seems obvious. The belief must be true. There really must be coffee in your kitchen. And you must have justification for this belief. Perhaps you remember buying coffee yesterday and you have not used it all. Or perhaps you can smell coffee brewing right now. These justify your belief. This seems straightforward enough. Knowledge is justified true belief. Philosophers abbreviate this as the JTB account. For roughly 2,000 years, most epistemologists accepted some version of this definition, though they debated the details of what counts as justification. Then, in 1963, a philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper that destroyed the traditional definition. The paper, titled "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?", presented 2 simple examples that shook epistemology to its core. These examples, now called Gettier cases, show that you can have a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. Here is how a Gettier case works. Imagine you work in an office with 2 colleagues, Smith and Jones. Both have applied for promotion. The boss tells you explicitly that Jones will get the promotion. You also observe Jones counting coins from his pocket, and you clearly see he has 10 coins. Based on this strong evidence, you form the belief that the person who will get the promotion has 10 coins in his pocket. This belief is justified. The boss told you directly, and you saw the coins yourself. Now imagine that, unknown to you, the boss was wrong or lying. You are actually getting the promotion, not Jones. But by coincidence, you also happen to have 10 coins in your pocket, though you have not counted them and do not know this. Your belief that the person who will get the promotion has 10 coins in his pocket is true. It is also justified based on excellent evidence. But do you really know it? Intuitively, no. You do not know this fact. You made a lucky inference from a false premise. Hundreds of similar examples have been created since Gettier. The barn facade case is particularly striking. Imagine you are driving through the countryside and you see what appears to be a barn. Based on this perception, you believe there is a barn there. your belief is true. It really is a barn. Your belief is justified. It looks exactly like a barn, and you have no reason to doubt your senses. But unknown to you, this region is filled with fake barn facades, wooden fronts that look like barns from the road. You just happen to look at the one real barn among dozens of fakes. Do you really know there is a barn there? Most philosophers say no. Your true belief was too lucky, too accidental. These examples reveal something profound. Justification does not eliminate luck entirely. You can have excellent justification for a belief. The belief can be true, yet you might not have knowledge because the connection between your justification and the truth is too accidental. The justified true belief account is insufficient. This created what philosophers call the Gettier problem. What must be added to justified true belief to get knowledge? Or perhaps the entire approach is wrong, and we need to replace, not supplement, the JTB account. Epistemologists proposed dozens of solutions. Some said knowledge requires a fourth condition. Perhaps your justification must be undefeated, meaning there is no true information that would undermine your justification if you learned it. In the promotion example, there is defeating information. The true fact that Jones will not get the promotion. If you learned this, it would destroy your justification. Others proposed that your belief must be caused by the right kind of process. Maybe knowledge requires that your belief was formed by a reliable method. Your senses in good conditions are reliable. Wild guesses are not. This approach, called reliabilism, shifts focus from justification to the reliability of belief-forming processes. Still others argued for a causal theory. Your belief must be caused by the fact that makes it true. You know there is a tree in front of you because the tree causes your visual experience, which causes your belief. In Gettier cases, the causal connection is broken or deviant, yet every proposed solution faced counterexamples. Philosophers constructed increasingly baroque Gettier cases to defeat each new theory. Some epistemologists began to despair. Linda Zagzebski argued in 1994 that Gettier problems are inescapable. Any theory that tries to add conditions to justified true belief will face similar problems. She showed how to construct a Gettier case for any such theory. Start with a justified false belief that meets your additional conditions. Then add luck so the belief becomes true. The result will be a justified true belief meeting your conditions that still is not knowledge. This sent epistemology in new directions. Some philosophers, like Timothy Williamson, argue that knowledge is actually more fundamental than belief or justification. Instead of analyzing knowledge in terms of these other concepts, we should analyze belief and justification in terms of knowledge. Knowledge is primitive, unanalyzable. This knowledge-first approach has gained significant support. Others embrace contextualism, the idea that whether a belief counts as knowledge depends on the context in which the question is asked. In ordinary contexts, with low stakes, your belief that you have hands counts as knowledge. But in a philosophy seminar discussing skeptical scenarios, the same belief might not count as knowledge because the standards have shifted. Some philosophers simply accept that we might never have a complete analysis of knowledge. Perhaps knowledge is like many concepts. We recognize it when we see it, but cannot give necessary and sufficient conditions. Just as we know what a game is without being able to define it perfectly, maybe we know what knowledge is without being able to analyze it completely. The Gettier problem remains unsolved after more than 60 years. This might seem like failure, but it reveals something important. The question, what is knowledge, is far more difficult than it first appears. What seems obvious, that knowledge is justified true belief, collapses under scrutiny, and every attempt to repair the definition faces devastating counterexamples. This matters beyond academic philosophy. Courts must decide what counts as knowing someone committed a crime versus merely having strong suspicions. Scientists must distinguish genuine scientific knowledge from well-supported hypotheses that might still be wrong. In artificial intelligence, researchers try to create systems that have knowledge, but they cannot do this without understanding what knowledge is. The Gettier problem also shows us something unsettling about the human condition. We confidently claim to know thousands of things. But when we examine carefully what knowledge requires, we find that many of our supposed knowledge claims are shakier than we thought. Perhaps you do not know as much as you believe you do. This realization motivates the rest of epistemology. If we cannot easily define knowledge, we must investigate more carefully where knowledge comes from, how beliefs are justified, what the structure of knowledge is, and whether skeptics might be right that genuine knowledge is impossible. Part 2. The sources of knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? If knowledge exists at all, it must come from somewhere. Your mind is not born containing all truths. You learned that fire burns, that water quenches thirst, that 2 + 2 = 4. But how did you learn these things? What are the fundamental sources that supply the human mind with knowledge? This question divides philosophers into two great camps that have battled for centuries: rationalists and empiricists. This conflict shapes not just philosophy, but science, education, politics, and how you understand your own mind. Rationalists argue that reason alone can deliver substantial knowledge about reality. The mind possesses innate ideas or the power to grasp truths through pure thought, independent of sensory experience. When you know that every effect has a cause, or that a thing cannot both exist and not exist at the same time, you know this through reason, not through looking at the world. Rationalists claim that the most important truths, the foundations of knowledge, come from rational insight rather than empirical observation. The great rationalists include Plato, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Plato argued that true knowledge concerns eternal forms that exist beyond the physical world. Your senses show you imperfect triangles drawn in sand or on paper, but your mind grasps the perfect form of triangle through reason. Descartes insisted that he could doubt everything delivered by his senses, but he could not doubt that he was thinking. "I think, therefore I am," came from pure reason, not sensory observation. From this rational foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild all knowledge. Rationalists typically embrace what philosophers call a priori knowledge, knowledge that can be known independently of experience. You do not need to observe the world to know that all bachelors are unmarried men, or that if all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, then Socrates is mortal. You grasp these truths through understanding the concepts and following logical reasoning. Mathematics provides the clearest examples. You know that 7 + 5 = 12, not by counting physical objects, but through rational insight into numerical relationships. Empiricists reject this picture. They argue that experience is the fundamental source of knowledge. The mind begins as a blank slate, and everything we know comes ultimately from sensory experience. John Locke famously denied innate ideas, arguing that if such ideas existed, everyone would possess them from birth. But infants and people with severe cognitive disabilities do not know mathematical truths or logical principles, which suggests these are learned rather than innate. The great empiricists include Aristotle, Locke, Berkeley and Hume. They emphasize a posteriori knowledge that depends on experience and can only be verified through observation. You know that snow is white because you have seen snow. You know that fire is hot because you have felt heat. You know that bread nourishes because you have experienced being sustained by eating it. Empiricists face a challenge explaining mathematical and logical knowledge. You have never observed the number 7 itself, yet you know mathematical truths about it. Empiricists respond in various ways. Some argue that mathematical truths are not about reality, but about our conventions and definitions. Others claim that even mathematical knowledge ultimately derives from manipulating physical objects and abstracting patterns. Mill argued that mathematical truths are highly confirmed generalizations from experience, not a priori certainties. The debate cuts deeper than these labels suggest. Both sides must account for several distinct sources that seem to provide knowledge. Perception appears to be a fundamental source. You know there is a computer screen in front of you because you see it. You know coffee is bitter because you taste it. The 5 senses deliver information about the external world. Empiricists naturally emphasize perception, but even rationalists must account for perceptual knowledge. The question is whether perception provides foundational knowledge or whether perceptual beliefs require rational justification. Reason or rational intuition seems to provide knowledge of logical and mathematical truths. You know that contradictions cannot be true. You know that if A is larger than B, and B is larger than C, then A is larger than C. This appears to be a priori knowledge, grasped through rational insight. Rationalists emphasize this source, but empiricists must explain it too, usually by reducing it to other sources. Memory extends your knowledge beyond the present moment. You know what you ate for breakfast because you remember it. Without memory, you would be trapped in the immediate present, unable to accumulate knowledge over time. Yet memory is fallible. False memories feel identical to true ones from the inside. This raises questions about whether memory is a genuine source of knowledge or merely preserves knowledge gained through other sources. Testimony from other people provides much of what you claim to know. You know your birth date not through direct observation, but because others told you. You know about historical events, distant places, and scientific discoveries through testimony. Some philosophers argue testimony is a basic source of knowledge, while others claim testimonial knowledge reduces to perceptual knowledge of what others say, combined with inductive reasoning about their reliability. Introspection gives you knowledge of your own mental states. You know you are in pain, that you're thinking about epistemology, that you desire coffee. This seems like a special kind of direct access to your own mind. Descartes thought introspective knowledge was perfectly certain. Others argue introspection is fallible and theory-laden, shaped by your concepts and expectations. Some philosophers add additional sources. Intuition might provide immediate rational insight into truths without reasoning through steps. You just see that certain principles are true. Imagination might allow you to grasp possibilities and impossibilities. Some argue for a moral sense that delivers ethical knowledge. Religious thinkers claim revelation provides knowledge from divine sources. The debate between rationalism and empiricism reached a kind of synthesis with Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that both sides grasped part of the truth. Experience is necessary for knowledge, but the mind is not passive. The mind actively structures experience through innate categories and forms of intuition. Space, time, causation, and logical principles are not learned from experience, but are the lens through which the mind interprets experience. Knowledge requires both rational structure and empirical content. The mind without content is empty, but content without structure is blind. Kant distinguished between analytic truths, which are true by virtue of meaning alone, and synthetic truths, which make substantive claims about reality. All bachelors are unmarried is analytic. All bachelors are unhappy is synthetic. He then asked, are synthetic a priori truths possible? Can we have substantive knowledge about reality independent of experience? Kant answered, yes. Mathematical truths and basic principles like causality are synthetic a priori. They tell us about reality, but are known through reason rather than observation. This Kantian synthesis dominated philosophy for generations, but it faces serious challenges. How exactly does the mind impose structure on experience? If our categories shape what we can know, can we ever know reality as it is in itself, apart from our mental framework? And 20th century developments in physics challenged Kant's examples. He thought Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics were synthetic a priori truths, necessary for any possible experience. But Einstein showed that space can be curved and time relative. This suggests that what Kant thought were necessary structures of the mind are actually empirical discoveries that could have been otherwise. Contemporary epistemology has moved beyond the simple rationalist versus empiricist dichotomy. Few philosophers are pure rationalists or pure empiricists today. Instead, epistemologists investigate specific questions about each source. How does perception deliver knowledge? What explains the special certainty of logical and mathematical knowledge? How reliable is memory? When should we trust testimony? The empiricist tradition leads naturally to naturalized epistemology, which treats knowledge as a natural phenomenon to be studied scientifically. Quine argued that epistemology should be part of psychology, investigating how organisms actually acquire beliefs. This approach studies perception, memory, and reasoning as cognitive processes using empirical methods. But critics argue that naturalized epistemology confuses questions about how we do form beliefs with questions about how we should form beliefs. Psychology tells us what happens. Epistemology tells us what ought to happen. The rationalist tradition connects to questions about the nature of philosophical knowledge itself. Can philosophy deliver substantive truths about reality through pure reason? Or must philosophy ultimately defer to empirical science? Some philosophers defend a priori philosophical knowledge. Others argue that philosophy can only clarify concepts and analyze the logical structure of our thought, not discover new truths about reality. The debate also matters for education and cognitive development. If rationalists are right that minds contain innate structures or capacities, education should focus on drawing out and developing these innate resources. Plato thought learning was really remembering truths the soul knew before birth. If empiricists are right that the mind begins blank, education should focus on providing rich experiences and proper associations. These different views lead to radically different educational approaches. The sources question also raises issues about cognitive diversity. If knowledge comes through reason and rational insight is universal, then all rational beings should reach the same conclusions. Disagreement suggests someone is reasoning incorrectly. But if knowledge comes through experience and different people have different experiences, then widespread disagreement is expected and perhaps ineliminable. This has implications for relativism and disagreement. Contemporary cognitive science reveals that both sides captured important truths. The mind does come equipped with innate structures. Infants have core knowledge systems for objects, numbers, agents, and spatial relations. Language acquisition relies on innate grammatical principles. This vindicates rationalists. But experience shapes and develops these capacities in profound ways. You are not born knowing English or calculus, even if you are born with capacities that make learning them possible. This vindicates empiricists. The sources of knowledge remain contested because the question is not purely empirical. It is partly a normative question about what should count as a legitimate source of knowledge. Should you trust rational intuition when it conflicts with observation? Should you trust perception when it conflicts with reason? Different answers produce different epistemologies and different standards for knowledge claims. Part 3. The structure of knowledge, the regress problem. Once you claim to know something, you can be asked, how do you know that? Your answer will be another claim, which can itself be questioned. How do you know that? This process of asking for reasons can continue indefinitely. Where does it stop? Must it stop? This is the epistemic regress problem, and it has haunted epistemology for over 2,000 years. The problem appears simple, but its implications are devastating. Consider a basic knowledge claim. You know that it is raining outside. How do you know? You looked out the window and saw rain falling. But how do you know your eyes are reliable? Past experience shows they usually work correctly. But how do you know past experience is a good guide to the future? And how do you know you are not dreaming right now, merely hallucinating rain? Each answer invites a further question. The chain of justification either continues forever, circles back to earlier claims, or stops somewhere. But each option seems problematic. An infinite chain means you never reach a foundation for your belief. A circular chain means you are using a belief to justify itself. And stopping arbitrarily seems to leave your belief unjustified. Ancient Pyrrhonian skeptics formulated this problem precisely. They identified 5 modes of suspension of judgment, and the regress argument was central. They observed that every proof requires premises, but those premises themselves require proof, leading either to infinite regress, circular reasoning, or arbitrary stopping points. Since none of these options succeeds, they concluded that knowledge is impossible, and we should suspend judgment about all claims. The regress problem forces epistemologists to choose between 3 main positions: foundationalism, coherentism, and infinitism. Each attempts to show that the regress does not undermine knowledge, but each faces serious objections. Foundationalism claims the regress stops at basic beliefs that are justified without being inferred from other beliefs. These foundational beliefs have autonomous justification. They do not need support from other beliefs because they are justified directly by experience, rational insight, or some other non-inferential source. Think of foundationalism like a building. The structure rests on a foundation that itself rests on solid ground, not on another level of the building. Your belief that you are in pain right now might be foundational, justified by your direct experience of pain rather than by inference from other beliefs. Your belief that you see red might be foundational, justified by your visual experience. Mathematical axioms might be foundational, justified by rational intuition. From these basic beliefs, other beliefs are justified inferentially. You justifiably believe it is raining because you have the foundational perceptual belief that you see rain, and you infer from this that it is actually raining. The non-foundational beliefs form a superstructure built on the foundation. Foundationalism comes in strong and weak versions. Strong foundationalism requires that basic beliefs be infallible, indubitable, or certain. Descartes sought beliefs he could not possibly doubt. He thought he could doubt everything delivered by perception because he might be dreaming or deceived by an evil demon. But he could not doubt his own existence while thinking, because doubting is itself a form of thinking. I think, therefore I am, became his first foundational certainty. From this he tried to build up all knowledge. Strong foundationalism faces two devastating problems. First, the foundation seems too narrow. Very few beliefs are truly indubitable. Can you really not doubt that you are in pain? Perhaps you are confused about what you feel. Can you not doubt that 2 + 2 = 4? Perhaps your mind is constitutionally flawed and incapable of correct reasoning. If only indubitable beliefs can be basic, almost nothing qualifies. Second, even if you have indubitable foundations, you face the problem of building up from them. Your belief that you seem to see a tree is perhaps indubitable, but your belief that there actually is a tree is not indubitable. You might be hallucinating. How do you get from indubitable claims about how things seem to fallible claims about how things are? The inference itself is not indubitable, so the superstructure collapses. Weak foundationalism relaxes the requirements for basic beliefs. Foundational beliefs need not be certain or infallible, merely justified in some special way. Perhaps perceptual beliefs are justified by default without needing further support, even though they can sometimes be wrong. Perhaps memory beliefs are prima facie justified, meaning they are justified unless you have specific reasons to doubt them. This makes the foundation broader and more realistic. Many beliefs can be basic, but it faces a different problem. If basic beliefs can be wrong, what makes them justified? If they need no reasons, why should we accept them? Critics charge that weak foundationalism is arbitrary. It simply declares certain beliefs justified without explanation. Foundationalists respond in several ways. Some appeal to direct acquaintance. You are directly acquainted with your own sensations, and this direct access justifies beliefs about them. Others appeal to proper function. If your cognitive faculties are working properly in the right environment, the beliefs they produce are justified. Reliabilism offers another foundationalist strategy. Basic beliefs are justified if produced by reliable processes, even if you cannot provide further reasons for them. Coherentism rejects foundations entirely. No beliefs are justified independently of other beliefs. Instead, beliefs are justified by their coherence with the entire system of beliefs. A belief is justified if it fits well with your other beliefs, increases the overall coherence of your belief system, and contributes to a comprehensive explanatory picture. Think of coherentism like a web or a floating raft. Each part supports every other part. No single strand touches solid ground, but the structure holds together through mutual support. Your belief that it is raining coheres with your belief that you see rain, your belief that the ground is wet, your belief that people are carrying umbrellas, and countless other beliefs. These beliefs mutually support each other. The coherence relation is not mere logical consistency. You could have a consistent set of beliefs about an entirely imaginary world. Coherence requires something richer: explanatory connections, probability raising, inferential relations. A coherent system is one where beliefs explain each other, where accepting one belief makes others more probable, where everything hangs together in an integrated picture. Coherentism elegantly handles the regress problem. The regress does not terminate or continue infinitely. It circles back, but this is not vicious circularity. Each belief provides some support to others, and this mutual support generates justification for the system as a whole. No belief needs autonomous justification because justification emerges from the coherent structure. But coherentism faces powerful objections. First, it seems divorced from reality. You could have a perfectly coherent system of beliefs about Middle-earth, with elves and hobbits and magic rings, all fitting together beautifully. But this would not constitute knowledge, because it is not connected to the actual world. Coherentists need to explain how coherence generates truth, not merely internal consistency. Second, coherentism appears to allow alternative, equally coherent systems. Perhaps one person has a coherent system where God exists and explains various features of the world. Another person has an equally coherent system where God does not exist and natural causes explain everything. If coherence is all that matters, both are justified, but they contradict each other, which seems wrong. Third, coherentism seems to ignore the special role of experience. Your perceptual experiences provide input from the world. They constrain your belief system in ways that cannot be captured purely by coherence. If you experience intense pain, this justifies your belief that you are in pain, regardless of how well this belief coheres with your other beliefs. Some coherentists respond by treating experiences themselves as beliefs, but critics argue this distorts the phenomenology of experience. Infinitism embraces the infinite regress. Knowledge does not require that the chain of justification terminates or circles back. Instead, justification involves an infinite series of reasons, each supported by the next. You need not possess all these reasons explicitly, but they must be available to you. This seems crazy at first. How could humans, with finite minds, have infinite chains of justification? Infinitists respond that the infinite series is potential rather than actual. You do not need to have formulated all the reasons, but you must be able to provide further reasons when challenged, and further reasons for those without limit. Consider defending the claim that it is raining. You appeal to your perceptual experience. When challenged, you appeal to past reliability of perception. When challenged further, you appeal to explanatory coherence between perception and reality. When challenged again, you appeal to evolutionary advantages of reliable perception. Each challenge produces a new reason, and the process could continue indefinitely as you bring more considerations to bear. Infinitism has few defenders, but Peter Klein has developed sophisticated arguments for it. He argues that foundationalism arbitrarily stops the regress, while coherentism illegitimately circles back. Only infinitism respects the principle that every belief needs justification from something else. He claims that in practice, we never trace justifications far enough to encounter problems. We stop when satisfied, not when we reach foundations or complete circles. Critics argue that infinitism is psychologically impossible. You cannot actually provide infinite reasons. Klein responds that availability, not actual possession, is what matters. But what does availability mean? If it means you could, in principle, provide more reasons, this seems too weak. Many false beliefs could satisfy this condition. If availability requires something stronger, it becomes unclear what infinitism adds to other positions. The debate between foundationalism, coherentism, and infinitism remains unresolved. Each position has defenders, and each faces serious objections. Some epistemologists combine elements of different positions. Perhaps some beliefs are foundational, while others are justified coherently. Perhaps the structure varies depending on the domain of knowledge. The regress problem also generates skeptical arguments. If none of the three positions succeeds, perhaps knowledge is impossible after all. You cannot have infinite chains of justification. Circular justification is illegitimate, and stopping arbitrarily leaves beliefs unjustified. Therefore, you know nothing. This is how ancient skeptics used the regress argument. Contemporary epistemology has developed more sophisticated tools for addressing the regress. Externalists argue that the regress only arises if you accept internalism, the view that justification must be accessible to the believer. If justification can be external, then beliefs might be justified by reliable processes, even if you cannot provide reasons. This does not stop the regress so much as show it never got started. Others argue that the regress problem assumes too much. Perhaps not all knowledge requires justification. Perhaps knowledge is more basic than justification, as Williamson argues. Or perhaps the demand for reasons itself needs justification, and once we examine this demand carefully, we see it is not as universal as it first appears. The structure of knowledge matters beyond abstract philosophy. It determines what counts as adequate justification in science, law, and everyday life. Scientists cannot provide infinite justifications for their theories. They stop at certain observational or theoretical principles. Are these foundations, or does scientific knowledge form a coherent web? Legal reasoning traces evidence back to witnesses and physical traces. Are these foundational, or must we justify trusting witnesses and physical evidence? The regress problem reveals that knowledge has a structure, and understanding this structure is essential to understanding knowledge itself. Whether that structure rests on foundations, forms a coherent whole, or extends infinitely remains one of epistemology's deepest puzzles. Part 4. Justification. What makes beliefs rational? Even if you have a true belief, it might not constitute knowledge. You need justification. But what is justification? What makes a belief justified rather than arbitrary? This question has generated some of the most intense debates in contemporary epistemology. The traditional view treats justification as what makes beliefs rational or reasonable. A justified belief is one you are entitled to hold, one that is epistemically responsible. This connects justification to obligations and duties. You have epistemic duties, to believe based on evidence, to avoid believing on insufficient grounds, to proportion belief to evidence. A justified belief is one that fulfills these duties. This deontological conception of justification was common among classical epistemologists. Locke insisted that it is wrong to believe without sufficient evidence. Clifford famously declared that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Violation of epistemic duties brings epistemic blame, just as violation of moral duties brings moral blame. But this conception faces a serious problem. Duties imply control. You cannot have a duty to do something unless you can control whether you do it. Yet beliefs seem not to be under your voluntary control. Right now, can you simply choose to believe that grass is blue? Can you decide to believe you can fly? Beliefs arise in you based on your experiences and your prior beliefs. You do not directly control them. If you cannot control your beliefs, you cannot have duties regarding them, and the deontological conception collapses. William Alston pressed this objection forcefully. He argued that beliefs are more like digestive processes than actions. They happen to you rather than being performed by you. Therefore, justification cannot be understood in terms of duties or obligations. Epistemologists responded in several ways. Some argue you do have indirect control over beliefs. You cannot simply decide to believe something, but you can control what evidence you gather, what sources you trust, what questions you investigate. You can cultivate intellectual virtues like open-mindedness and carefulness. These indirect controls generate duties, even if you cannot directly control individual beliefs. Others abandon the deontological conception entirely. They argue that justification is not about duties, but about reliability or proper function, or fitting the evidence. A belief is justified if it is produced by reliable processes, or if it fits well with your evidence, regardless of whether you have control or fulfill duties. This debate connects to a deeper divide between internalism and externalism about justification. This distinction shapes contemporary epistemology profoundly. Internalism holds that justification depends only on factors internal to the believer's perspective. What justifies your belief must be accessible to you through reflection or introspection. If you cannot tell whether the justifying factors obtain, they do not truly justify your belief. The internalist slogan is, justification must be accessible from the first-person perspective. Why accept internalism? Internalists argue it respects the connection between justification and rationality. Whether you are rational in believing something depends on your perspective, on what you can access. Imagine someone whose beliefs are produced by a crystal ball that reliably delivers true beliefs, but the person has no idea this is happening and has no reason to trust the crystal ball. From their perspective, accepting these beliefs seems irrational, even though the beliefs are reliably produced. Internalists conclude that reliable production is not sufficient for justification. Internalism also preserves the deontological connection. If justification depends on accessible factors, you can fulfill or fail to fulfill epistemic duties. You are responsible for believing based on evidence you possess, not based on factors you cannot access. But internalism faces problems. First, it seems to require too much. Must you really be able to tell, just by reflection, what justifies your beliefs? When you remember that you had coffee this morning, you cannot introspectively access the complex neural processes that make memory reliable. Yet, surely your memory belief can be justified. Second, internalism appears to allow that you could be perfectly justified in believing something false. Imagine you are a brain in a vat, fed perfect hallucinations of an ordinary world. From your perspective, everything appears exactly as it does to a normal person. Internalists say your beliefs are justified, even though they are massively false. But this seems wrong. How can you be justified in believing the utterly false? Externalism holds that justification can depend on factors external to the believer's perspective. What matters is the actual reliability of your belief-forming processes, or whether your faculties are functioning properly in the right environment or other objective features. You need not be able to access these factors through reflection. The most influential form of externalism is reliabilism, developed by Alvin Goldman. Reliabilism says a belief is justified if and only if it is produced by a reliable belief-forming process. Vision in good lighting is reliable. Wishful thinking is unreliable. If your belief that there is a tree in front of you was produced by vision in good lighting, it is justified. If it was produced by wishful thinking, it is not justified, even if it happens to be true. Reliabilism elegantly explains why certain sources produce justified beliefs. Perception justifies because it is reliable. Memory justifies because it is reliable. Wild guessing does not justify because it is unreliable. The account is naturalistic, connecting justification to objective features of cognitive processes that can be studied scientifically. But reliabilism faces objections. The generality problem asks, which process are we talking about? Vision is reliable, but vision in dim lighting is less reliable, and vision in dim lighting, while distracted, is even less reliable. As we make the process description more specific, reliability can change dramatically. How do we determine the right level of generality? Without an answer, reliabilism cannot determine which beliefs are justified. The new evil demon problem challenges reliabilism more deeply. Imagine someone in a demon world, systematically deceived, whose perceptual processes are unreliable. Yet, from their perspective, they are forming beliefs exactly as we do. Intuitively, they seem just as rational and justified as we are, even though their processes are unreliable. Reliabilism says their beliefs are unjustified, which seems wrong. Some reliabilists respond by distinguishing justification from blamelessness. The demon victim is blameless but not justified. Others complicate reliabilism by adding internalist elements. Perhaps justification requires both reliability and the absence of defeaters accessible to the believer. Another externalist approach appeals to proper function. Alvin Plantinga argues that a belief is warranted if it is produced by properly functioning cognitive faculties operating in the environment for which they were designed. Your visual system, functioning properly in good lighting, produces warranted perceptual beliefs. A malfunctioning visual system, or a visual system in an environment radically different from the one it evolved for, does not produce warranted beliefs. This proper function theory connects epistemology to the design plan of cognitive faculties. For theists like Plantinga, God designed human cognitive faculties. For naturalists, evolution designed them. Either way, proper function provides an objective standard for when beliefs are warranted. Critics question what counts as proper function. Is a cognitive faculty functioning properly when it produces false beliefs? In some environments, false beliefs might be adaptive. Overestimating dangers might enhance survival even while producing false beliefs about the frequency of threats. Does this count as proper function? The theory needs an account of the purpose of cognitive faculties, which is contested. Some epistemologists embrace evidentialism, which holds that justification is a matter of believing in accordance with your evidence. Your belief is justified if and only if it fits your evidence well. This can be developed in internalist or externalist ways, depending on whether evidence is construed as accessible mental states or as objective facts. Internalist evidentialists like Richard Feldman and Earl Coney argue that your evidence consists of your mental states, your experiences, memories, beliefs. Justification depends on whether your belief fits this internal evidence. Externalist versions might count facts themselves as evidence, whether or not you have direct access to them. Evidentialism faces questions about what counts as evidence and what it means to fit the evidence. If evidence is just more beliefs, we face a regress. If evidence includes non-doxastic states like experiences, we need an account of how experiences provide evidential support. And what does fitting the evidence mean? Must the belief be entailed by the evidence? Highly probable, given the evidence, or something weaker? Virtue epistemology offers a different approach, focusing on intellectual character rather than individual beliefs. Just as virtue ethics evaluates actions based on whether they manifest virtues like courage and honesty, virtue epistemology evaluates beliefs based on whether they result from intellectual virtues like open-mindedness, intellectual courage, and carefulness. Ernest Sosa distinguishes between animal knowledge, which requires reliable belief formation, and reflective knowledge, which additionally requires knowing that your belief is reliably formed. Reflective knowledge involves intellectual virtue, the ability to assess your own cognitive performance. This creates a two-level epistemology that incorporates both externalist and internalist elements. Linda Zagzebski develops a more thoroughly virtue-based approach. She argues that knowledge is true belief arising from acts of intellectual virtue. An intellectually virtuous person forms beliefs through careful reasoning, genuine concern for truth, and well-developed cognitive skills. Knowledge is the success of intellectual virtue, just as moral action is the success of moral virtue. Virtue epistemology shifts focus from isolated beliefs to patterns of cognitive behavior and character. This connects epistemology to ethics and to questions about intellectual flourishing. But critics question whether virtue is really doing the work. Perhaps what matters is whether a virtuous person's cognitive processes are reliable, in which case virtue epistemology reduces to reliabilism. The justification debate matters immensely for practical epistemology. Courts must decide whether evidence justifies belief in guilt. Scientists must decide whether evidence justifies accepting a theory. Individuals must decide whether their beliefs are justified or whether they should suspend judgment. Different conceptions of justification lead to different verdicts. An internalist might say you are justified in believing your spouse is faithful if you have no accessible evidence of infidelity, even if your spouse is actually cheating in ways you cannot detect. An externalist reliabilist might say you are not justified because your belief-forming process is actually unreliable in this case, even if you cannot tell this from your perspective. The justification debate also matters for skepticism. If justification requires accessible reasons, and those reasons require further reasons, internalism leads naturally to skeptical worries. If justification depends on reliability, and we cannot know whether our faculties are reliable without circular reasoning, externalism faces its own skeptical challenges. No consensus has emerged on what justification is. Internalism and externalism both have dedicated defenders. Reliabilism, proper function theories, evidentialism, and virtue epistemology all have supporters. Many epistemologists adopt hybrid views, combining elements of different approaches. What is clear is that justification cannot be understood in a simple, straightforward way. Whether beliefs are justified depends on subtle features of cognitive processes, evidential relationships, and epistemic perspective. Understanding justification requires grappling with these complexities rather than accepting a simple definition. Part 5. The Skeptical Challenge: Can we know anything? Throughout our exploration, skeptical doubts have lurked in the shadows. Now we confront them directly. Skepticism is the view that knowledge is impossible, or at least far more limited than we ordinarily think. Skeptical arguments attempt to show that our supposed knowledge rests on foundations we cannot justify. These arguments are not mere intellectual puzzles. They strike at the heart of human confidence in our ability to understand reality. Skepticism comes in degrees and varieties. Global skepticism claims we know nothing at all. This extreme position is difficult to maintain consistently. If you know nothing, how do you know that you know nothing? Claiming to know that knowledge is impossible seems self-refuting. More commonly, philosophers defend local skepticism about particular domains. External world skepticism denies knowledge of the physical world beyond our experiences. Skepticism about other minds denies knowledge that other people have conscious experiences. Skepticism about induction denies knowledge of the future based on past patterns. Moral skepticism denies ethical knowledge. The most influential skeptical arguments trace to ancient Greek philosophy. Pyrrhonian skeptics, named after Pyrrho of Elis, did not assert that knowledge is impossible. Instead, they practiced suspension of judgment. For any claim, they could produce equally strong arguments on both sides, leading to equipollence. Unable to determine which side was correct, they suspended judgment about everything except how things appear to them. The Pyrrhonians developed modes or argument patterns for inducing suspension of judgment. The mode from disagreement notes that people disagree about nearly everything, and there is no non-question-begging way to determine who is right. The mode from relativity observes that things appear differently to different observers in different circumstances, and we cannot access how things are independently of how they appear to us. The mode from infinite regress we have already encountered. Pyrrhonian skepticism was not meant to cause despair, but to achieve tranquility. The skeptics noticed that people are disturbed by their beliefs and the conflicts between beliefs. Suspend judgment, and you achieve ataraxia, a state of peaceful indifference. You live according to appearances and customs without believing anything dogmatically. This transforms skepticism from an intellectual position to a way of life. But ancient skepticism largely disappeared from Western philosophy for over 1,000 years, until it was revived in devastating form by René Descartes in the 17th century. Ironically, Descartes was not himself a skeptic. He wanted to defeat skepticism by finding absolutely certain foundations for knowledge. But his skeptical arguments proved more influential than his attempted solutions. Descartes began his meditations on first philosophy by resolving to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted, seeking an indubitable foundation. First, he noted that the senses sometimes deceive us. Distant towers appear round, but are actually square. Objects in water appear bent. If the senses sometimes deceive, how can we trust them in any particular case? Perhaps our senses systematically mislead us about the external world. You might respond that you can distinguish cases where perception is reliable from cases where it is unreliable. You trust perception in good conditions, but not in poor conditions. But Descartes offers a deeper challenge: the dream argument. Right now, as you read this, how do you know you're not dreaming? Dreams can feel exactly like waking experience. In dreams, you believe you're awake and experiencing reality. You have no way to tell from the inside whether you are dreaming or awake. Therefore, you cannot know anything about the external world based on perceptual experience. This argument is powerful because it undermines perception globally, not just in particular cases. Even in apparently ideal conditions, you might be dreaming. The argument does not claim you are dreaming, only that you cannot rule this out. And if you cannot rule it out, you cannot know you are perceiving reality. Descartes went further with the evil demon hypothesis. Suppose a powerful, malicious demon is systematically deceiving you. This demon feeds you false perceptions, false memories, false reasoning. Everything you experience is an illusion created by the demon. The demon is so powerful and clever that you have no way to detect the deception. In such a scenario, all your beliefs about the external world would be false. The demon hypothesis might seem crazy, but that is not the point. The skeptical argument does not claim there is such a demon. It claims you cannot rule out this possibility. And if you cannot rule it out, you cannot know your beliefs are not products of demonic deception. Since knowledge requires ruling out such possibilities, you do not have knowledge of the external world. Modern versions of Descartes' arguments replace the demon with scientific scenarios. Hilary Putnam's brain, in a vat hypothesis, imagines that you are not a human being but a disembodied brain suspended in a vat of nutrients. Scientists or computers stimulate your brain to produce the experiences of ordinary life. Everything you experience is a simulation. The Matrix films popularized this idea, though philosophers had discussed it for decades. The brain in a vat scenario is not mere science fiction. It is logically possible, and it is indistinguishable from normal experience. A brain in a vat, receiving perfect simulations, would have exactly the experiences you are having now. So, how do you know you are not a brain in a vat? You cannot point to your experiences because those would be the same either way. You cannot reason your way out, because a brain in a vat might be caused to have that very reasoning. The skeptical conclusion: you do not know you are not a brain in a vat, and therefore you do not know anything about the external world. These skeptical arguments follow a common pattern. First, they describe a skeptical scenario that is inconsistent with your ordinary beliefs, but consistent with your experiences. Second, they claim you cannot rule out the scenario without begging the question. Third, they argue that if you cannot rule out the scenario, you do not know that your ordinary beliefs are true. This form of argument can be applied to any empirical domain, generating systematic skepticism about the external world. David Hume developed a different skeptical challenge focused on induction. All our beliefs about the unobserved future rest on inductive reasoning. You believe the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every day in the past. You believe bread will nourish you because it has always nourished you before. Science predicts future events based on observed patterns and laws discovered through past observations. But what justifies induction? Why should we think the future will resemble the past? Hume argued that we cannot justify induction. Any attempt to justify induction is either circular or rests on an unjustified assumption. Consider trying to justify induction. You might argue that induction has worked well in the past, producing true beliefs and successful predictions. Therefore, induction will probably work well in the future. But this argument uses induction to justify induction. You are inferring from past success of induction to future success of induction, which is itself an inductive inference. The reasoning is circular. Perhaps induction rests on a principle, the principle of uniformity of nature, which states that the future will resemble the past, or that nature follows regular laws. If we could justify this principle, we could justify induction. But how do we justify the principle of uniformity? We cannot observe it directly. We cannot deduce it from logic alone, because it is a substantive claim about the world. The only way to support it is through inductive evidence from past observations. But this again uses induction to justify induction. Hume concluded that induction cannot be rationally justified. Yet we cannot help but reason inductively. It is built into human psychology. We are caused by custom and habit to expect the future to resemble the past. Reason does not justify induction. Nature compels it. This leads to Hume's famous conclusion that belief is more properly an act of the sensitive than of the cogitative part of our natures. Hume's skepticism about induction is particularly troubling because science depends entirely on inductive reasoning. Every scientific law, every prediction, every theoretical claim rests on inferring from observed instances to unobserved instances, or from past regularities to future regularities. If induction cannot be justified, the entire scientific enterprise lacks rational foundation. Some philosophers argue that Hume proved too much. If induction is unjustified, then believing in induction and believing in anti-induction, that the future will not resemble the past, are equally irrational. But believing in anti-induction leads to absurd conclusions. You should believe that gravity will stop working, that the sun will not rise, that food will poison you. Since we must act somehow, and acting on induction is no worse than acting on anti-induction, we might as well use induction. But this pragmatic response does not answer Hume's epistemic challenge. It explains why we use induction, but does not show we are justified in doing so. Skepticism also arises from the problem of criterion, articulated by the Pyrrhonian skeptics and revived by contemporary epistemologists. To know something, we need a criterion for distinguishing knowledge from mere belief. But to trust that criterion, we need to know it is a good criterion. This requires applying the criterion to itself. If the criterion passes its own test, we are reasoning circularly. If it fails, the criterion is unreliable. Either way, we cannot justify our criterion for knowledge without presupposing that criterion. For example, suppose we say perception is a criterion for knowledge. To justify trusting perception, we need to know it is reliable. But we cannot know it is reliable without using perception to check whether perceptual beliefs match reality. We use perception to validate perception, which is circular. The problem of criterion creates a dilemma. Either we have a criterion for knowledge, which cannot be justified without circularity, or we have no criterion, in which case we cannot distinguish knowledge from ignorance. Either horn impales us on skepticism. Contemporary epistemology has generated additional skeptical problems. The lottery paradox, developed by Henry Kaiberg, shows tensions in our reasoning about probability. If you hold a ticket in a fair lottery with 1,000,000 tickets, you do not know your ticket will lose, even though it almost certainly will lose. And you do not know any other specific ticket will lose. but you do know exactly one ticket will win. So you know one ticket will win, but you do not know that any particular ticket will win or lose. This creates inconsistent beliefs that each seem individually justified. The preface paradox, noticed by David Mackinson, observes that authors often write in prefaces that despite their best efforts, their books probably contain some errors. If the author justifiably believes each claim in the book and justifiably believes the book contains errors, the author has contradictory justified beliefs. Both the belief that everything in the book is true, implied by justifiably believing each claim, and the belief that something in the book is false, stated in the preface, seem justified. Yet they cannot both be true. These paradoxes reveal that our ordinary epistemic practices contain hidden tensions. We cannot simultaneously accept every principle that seems intuitively correct. Something must be revised, but epistemologists disagree about what. Skeptical arguments matter because they reveal the difficulty of justifying our most basic beliefs and practices. We think we know countless things about the world, but when pressed to justify these knowledge claims, we struggle. The skeptic is not claiming to know that we're deceived. The skeptic merely points out that we cannot prove we are not deceived, and this inability undermines our knowledge claims. The skeptical challenge is not just an intellectual exercise. It raises practical questions about when we should act on beliefs and when we should remain uncertain. It challenges the authority of experts and institutions that claim knowledge. It forces us to examine the foundations of science, law, and common sense. Some philosophers embrace skepticism, at least about certain domains. They argue we should be more modest in our knowledge claims, more willing to admit uncertainty. Others see skepticism as a disease to be cured, an intellectual threat that must be defeated to preserve our confidence in reason and science. Part 6. Responses to Skepticism. Fighting back. Skeptical arguments are powerful, but most philosophers reject skepticism. The arguments might seem unanswerable in the philosophy seminar, but when you leave the room, you continue to believe you have hands, that other people exist, that the sun will rise tomorrow. This discrepancy between philosophical argument and ordinary conviction demands explanation. How can we respond to skepticism? Can we refute it, or must we simply acknowledge its force while living as though it were false? The responses to skepticism divide into several broad strategies. Some philosophers attempt direct refutation, showing that skeptical arguments rest on false premises or invalid reasoning. Others accept that skepticism cannot be conclusively refuted, but argue we are nevertheless justified in our ordinary beliefs. Still others embrace contextualism, claiming that knowledge attributions shift meaning depending on context, so skepticism is true in some contexts but false in others. The most famous direct response came from G.E. Moore in the early 20th century. Moore simply asserted what the skeptic denies. Hold up your hands and say, here is one hand and here is another. Therefore, external objects exist. Moore claimed to know with certainty that he had hands. This knowledge was more certain than any philosophical argument for skepticism. If a philosophical argument leads to the conclusion that you do not know you have hands, the argument must be wrong, because you obviously do know you have hands. This seems question-begging. The skeptic argues you do not know you have hands because you cannot rule out that you are dreaming or deceived by a demon. Moore simply asserts that he does know. Who is right? Moore's response called Morean common sense, holds that common sense beliefs are more certain than any philosophical argument. When philosophy conflicts with common sense, reject philosophy, not common sense. But why should common sense trump philosophical argument? The skeptic provides reasons for doubt. More provides no reasons for his certainty, just the assertion of certainty. This appears dogmatic. Yet many philosophers find Morean responses compelling. There is something absurd about doubting whether you have hands while looking right at them. The skeptical arguments must go wrong somewhere, even if we cannot precisely identify where. More's approach connects to a broader strategy, shifting the burden of proof. Instead of trying to prove you have knowledge, demand that the skeptic prove you lack knowledge. The skeptic typically argues that you cannot rule out certain possibilities and therefore you do not know. But why must you rule out every logically possible alternative to know something? This seems like an unreasonably high standard. This response develops into the relevant alternatives theory, articulated by Fred Dretske and others. You do not need to rule out all possible alternatives to your belief to have knowledge. You only need to rule out relevant alternatives. When you look at a zebra in a zoo and believe it is a zebra, you do not need to rule out that it is a cleverly disguised mule. That is not a relevant alternative in normal circumstances. Zoos do not disguise mules as zebras. But you would need to rule out that it is a horse rather than a zebra, because horses are relevantly similar and might actually be in a zoo. Relevance depends on practical considerations, probabilities, and context. Skeptical scenarios like brains in vats or evil demons are not relevant alternatives in ordinary contexts. They are far-fetched, improbable, disconnected from practical life. Therefore, you can know things about the external world without ruling them out. The skeptic objects. Who decides what is relevant? If anything counts as knowledge, it must be absolutely certain. Ruling out all logical possibilities seems required for genuine knowledge. But this sets the bar impossibly high. Perhaps we should revise our conception of knowledge to match actual practice rather than demanding impossible certainty. This leads to contextualism about knowledge attributions. Keith DeRose, David Lewis and Stuart Cohen developed sophisticated contextualist theories. They argue that the word knows is context-sensitive, like tall or flat. Whether someone counts as tall depends on the comparison class and conversational context. Whether a surface counts as flat depends on the standards relevant in that context. Similarly, whether someone knows something depends on the epistemic standards relevant in the conversational context. In ordinary contexts, with relaxed standards, you know you have hands because you can rule out all the relevant alternatives like misperception or prosthetics. In philosophical contexts, where skeptical scenarios are raised, the standards shift higher. Now you must rule out that you are dreaming or a brain in a vat. Since you cannot rule these out, you do not know you have hands in this high standards context. Contextualism allows both the skeptic and the ordinary person to be right, just in different contexts. In the philosophy seminar, where skeptical scenarios are salient, skepticism is true. In ordinary life, where those scenarios are not salient, you have knowledge. The appearance of contradiction disappears because knows means something different in each context. But critics question whether contextualism solves the problem or merely relabels it. The skeptic is not just claiming that we fail to meet some arbitrary high standards. The skeptic argues that we cannot know anything about the external world if we cannot distinguish our situation from skeptical scenarios. This seems like a real philosophical problem, not merely a shift in conversational standards. Furthermore, contextualism has counterintuitive consequences. It implies that merely mentioning a skeptical scenario can destroy your knowledge. Before the skeptical possibility was raised, you knew you had hands. After it is raised, you no longer know. But how can merely talking about a possibility eliminate knowledge? Your epistemic situation has not changed, only the conversational context. A different anti-skeptical strategy appeals to inference to the best explanation. This response accepts that you cannot deduce the existence of the external world from your experiences. You cannot rule out with certainty that you are dreaming or deceived, but you can reasonably infer that an external world exists because this is the best explanation of your experiences. Why do you have the experiences you have? One explanation is that an external world of physical objects causes these experiences. Another explanation is that a demon deceives you, or you are a brain in a vat, or you are dreaming. The external world explanation is simpler, more coherent, and fits better with everything else you believe. By inference to the best explanation, you are justified in believing the external world exists. Laurence Bonjour developed this approach in detail. He argues that the existence of a physical world is vastly more probable than skeptical alternatives given the coherence and orderliness of our experiences. If you were dreaming or being deceived, your experiences would be chaotic and contradictory. But they are remarkably stable and follow predictable patterns. This stability is evidence for an external world. Skeptics respond that inference to the best explanation assumes that the best explanation is likely to be true. But what justifies this assumption? Perhaps the true explanation is not the simplest or most coherent. A demon might prefer to create coherent illusions. Without independent access to reality, you cannot check whether your inference method reliably reaches truth. The response uses the very reasoning that skepticism challenges. Some philosophers take a more concessive approach. They accept that skeptical arguments cannot be refuted, but argue this does not undermine our ordinary practices. Hume took this line regarding induction. He admitted that induction cannot be rationally justified, but argued we cannot help reasoning inductively anyway. It is built into human nature. We should continue using induction while acknowledging we cannot prove it works. This naturalistic response separates questions about justification from questions about what we must believe. We must believe in the external world and use inductive reasoning, not because we can prove these practices are correct, but because we are psychologically constituted to do so. Trying to live as a skeptic is impossible. As Hume said, once you leave your study and interact with the world, skeptical doubts evaporate. But this concedes too much. If we cannot rationally justify our beliefs and practices, what distinguishes them from superstition or dogmatism? Why should we prefer scientific reasoning to astrology if neither can be justified? The naturalistic response explains why we believe what we do, but does not show we are right to believe it. Pragmatist philosophers like William James offer a different reconciliation. James argued that beliefs are tools for navigating experience, not pictures representing reality. A belief is justified if it works, if it leads to successful prediction and practical action. Skeptical scenarios do not matter because they make no practical difference. Whether you are a brain in a vat or a normal person, you should act the same way, believe the same things, make the same predictions. since skeptical scenarios are empirically equivalent to normal life. They are meaningless distinctions. But critics question whether practical success indicates truth. False beliefs might sometimes be more useful than true ones. Evolution might favor false but adaptive beliefs. If justification is just usefulness, it seems disconnected from truth, which conflicts with our intuition that justified beliefs should be more likely to be true. Reliabilism offers an externalist response to skepticism. Remember that reliabilism says beliefs are justified if produced by reliable processes. You are not required to know or prove your processes are reliable. If they are in fact reliable, your beliefs are justified, even if you cannot rule out skeptical scenarios. This bypasses the skeptical demand to prove you are not deceived. Even if you cannot prove your perceptual processes are reliable without circular reasoning, if they are actually reliable, your perceptual beliefs are justified. The brain in a vat's beliefs are not justified because its processes are unreliable, feeding it false information. Your beliefs are justified because your processes are reliable. But this response seems to miss the force of skepticism. The skeptic points out that from your subjective perspective, you cannot tell whether you are like the brain in the vat or like a normal person. You might confidently believe your processes are reliable, but so would the brain in the vat. Reliabilism saves justification by making it something you might have without knowing you have it. But this seems to disconnect justification from rationality and responsibility. Some philosophers embrace disjunctivism about perceptual experience. Disjunctivists argue that veridical perception and hallucination are fundamentally different kinds of mental states, not merely true versus false beliefs based on the same experiential evidence. When you genuinely perceive a tree, you are directly aware of the tree itself. When you hallucinate a tree, you are not aware of any tree. The mental states are different in kind, not just in truth value. If disjunctivism is correct, skeptical scenarios do not have the force they seem to have. The skeptic argues that your experience could be the same whether you're genuinely perceiving or hallucinating. But the disjunctivist denies this. Genuine perception is not the same as hallucination. You can tell the difference from the inside because they are different kinds of experiences. This blocks skeptical arguments that depend on the claim that you cannot distinguish your situation from skeptical scenarios. Critics argue that disjunctivism conflicts with phenomenology. Hallucinations can feel exactly like genuine perceptions. Someone who is hallucinating might be unable to tell they are hallucinating. If the experiences can feel identical, they must be the same kind of mental state, which contradicts disjunctivism. No response to skepticism has achieved universal acceptance. Each strategy has defenders and critics. Some philosophers simply accept that skeptical problems cannot be solved and focus on other epistemological questions. Others continue seeking a decisive refutation of skepticism. What is clear is that skepticism cannot be casually dismissed. The skeptical arguments are powerful and reveal deep puzzles about knowledge, justification, and rationality. Even if we cannot refute skepticism completely, wrestling with it clarifies what knowledge requires and what standards we should use in evaluating beliefs. Skepticism serves as a permanent reminder that knowledge is difficult, that certainty is rare, and that humility about our cognitive abilities is appropriate. Part 7. Perception and the external world. We have touched on perception repeatedly, but now we must examine it directly. Perception is how you connect with the world beyond your mind. Through sight, hearing, touch, taste and smell, you gain information about your environment. Nearly everything you claim to know about the physical world traces back ultimately to perceptual experience. But what is perception, and how does it deliver knowledge? This question generates some of epistemology's deepest problems. The problem of perception asks, what is the relationship between perceptual experience and external reality? When you see a tree, what are you directly aware of? Are you directly aware of the tree itself, or only of a mental representation of the tree? This seemingly simple question fractures into competing theories with radically different implications. Direct realism, also called naive realism, holds that in perception you are directly aware of external objects themselves. When you see a tree, the tree itself is present to your consciousness. There is no intermediary between your mind and the world. Perception is a direct relation between the perceiver and the perceived object. Direct realism has intuitive appeal. It matches how perception seems from the inside. When you look at your hand, you seem to be seeing your actual hand, not some mental image of your hand. The hand itself appears to be right there in your experience. Direct realism also avoids skeptical problems. If you are directly aware of external objects, you can know they exist. There is no gap between appearance and reality that needs to be bridged. But direct realism faces devastating objections. The argument from hallucination notes that hallucinations can be subjectively indistinguishable from genuine perceptions. When you hallucinate a pink elephant, no pink elephant exists, yet you have an experience qualitatively identical to seeing a pink elephant. If hallucinations do not involve direct awareness of external objects and hallucinations can be indistinguishable from genuine perceptions, then genuine perceptions do not involve direct awareness of external objects either. The argument assumes that indistinguishable experiences must have the same nature. The argument from illusion points to cases where perception misrepresents reality. A straight stick looks bent when partially submerged in water. A white wall looks red under red lighting. A round tower looks square from a distance. In these cases, the object appears different from how it really is. You cannot be directly aware of the object as it is because your experience represents it incorrectly. Instead, you must be aware of something else, something that really is bent or red or square. The time lag argument observes that perception takes time. Light from distant stars takes years to reach your eyes. When you see a star, you are seeing how it was years ago, not how it is now. The star might have exploded centuries ago, yet you see it shining. You cannot be directly aware of the star as it is now, because the light has not reached you yet. This suggests perception involves awareness of something other than the object itself. These arguments motivated indirect realism, also called representative realism. Indirect realism holds that perception involves an intermediary between mind and world. You are directly aware not of external objects, but of mental representations or sense data. These mental entities represent external objects but are distinct from them. When you see a tree, you are directly aware of a visual sense datum that represents the tree. The tree causes the sense datum, but you never directly perceive the tree itself. Indirect realism solves the problems facing direct realism. Hallucinations involve sense data not caused by external objects. Illusions involve sense data that misrepresent external objects. The time lag is explained because you perceive sense data caused by past states of external objects. All perceptual experiences have the same basic structure, awareness of sense data. But indirect realism creates a worse problem: the veil of perception. If you are only directly aware of sense data, never external objects themselves, how can you know anything about external objects? You are trapped behind a veil of perception, unable to peek around it to check whether your sense data accurately represent reality. External objects become theoretical entities inferred from sense data, not directly observed. This generates skeptical worries. Perhaps external objects do not exist at all. Perhaps sense data are all that exist. Or perhaps external objects exist but are completely different from what your sense data suggest. You have no way to compare sense data to external objects to check whether they match, because you only have access to sense data. John Locke tried to avoid this skepticism by distinguishing primary from secondary qualities. Primary qualities like shape, size, motion and number really exist in objects themselves. Secondary qualities like color, sound, taste, and smell exist only in the mind, caused by primary qualities. Your sense data of secondary qualities do not resemble anything in objects, but your sense data of primary qualities do resemble the objects. But George Berkeley pointed out that this distinction collapses. The same arguments that show secondary qualities are mind-dependent apply equally to primary qualities. When a tower looks square from a distance but round up close, its apparent shape changes with viewing conditions. Shape is no more objective than colour. All qualities we perceive are mind-dependent. Berkeley drew a radical conclusion. External material objects do not exist. All that exists are minds and ideas in minds. What we call physical objects are collections of ideas. The tree exists when perceived, but what does it mean to say it exists when not perceived? Berkeley answered that God continuously perceives everything, so objects continue to exist when humans are not perceiving them. This idealist position eliminates the gap between perception and reality by denying reality is anything beyond perception. But idealism seems crazy. Surely physical objects exist independently of perception. If everyone stopped existing, trees and rocks would continue existing. Berkeley responds that God would still perceive them. Without God, his idealism collapses into solipsism, the view that only you and your experiences exist. Modern philosophy of perception has developed more sophisticated versions of these positions. Sense datum theories were popular in the early 20th century, but face problems specifying what sense data are. Are they mental entities? Physical entities? How do they relate to brain states? The notion of sense data began to seem obscure and theoretically problematic. Adverbial theories offer an alternative to sense data. Instead of saying you are aware of a red sense datum when you see something red, adverbialists say you sense redly. The redness modifies the sensing, the mental act, rather than being a property of an object you sense. This avoids positing sense data as intermediaries while still accounting for how hallucinations and illusions differ from genuine perceptions. But adverbialism faces its own difficulties. What does it mean to sense redly? This seems to just rename the problem rather than solving it. And how do we account for the apparent objects of perception? When you see a tree, it seems like there is something you are seeing, not just that you are seeing tree-ishly. Intentionalism, also called representationalism, offers a contemporary approach. Intentionalists argue that perceptual experiences have intentional content. They represent the world as being a certain way. When you see a tree, your experience represents that there is a tree before you. The experience has content, but the content need not correspond to any special mental object. Hallucinations have content that fails to correspond to reality, while genuine perceptions have content that does correspond. This view accommodates the insights of indirect realism without requiring mysterious sense data. Experiences represent external objects, but do not involve awareness of intermediaries. It also explains illusions and hallucinations without treating them as fundamentally different from genuine perceptions. All perceptual experiences have representational content. They differ in whether that content accurately represents reality. Critics question whether intentionalism captures the phenomenology of perception. When you see something red, is there not a distinctive reddish quality to your experience beyond the mere representation that something is red? Phenomenal properties, sometimes called qualia, seem to be features of experiences themselves, not just features of what experiences represent. The debate over perception connects to broader metaphysical questions. What is the relationship between mind and world? Are mental states part of the physical world or something separate? Can consciousness be explained in physical terms? These are not purely epistemological questions, but they shape how we understand perceptual knowledge. Perception also raises questions about perceptual knowledge specifically. Granted that perception provides some information about the external world, what exactly can you know through perception? Can you perceive only simple properties like colours and shapes, or can you perceive complex facts like that someone is angry or that a situation is dangerous? Some philosophers distinguish between perceiving and seeing as. You might see a complex arrangement of shapes and colours, but see it as a face. The seeing as involves conceptual interpretation beyond bare perception. Others argue that perception is theory-laden from the start. What you perceive depends on your concepts, beliefs, and expectations. Experts perceive things differently than novices because they bring different conceptual frameworks. This has implications for the foundations of knowledge. If perception is theory-laden, perceptual beliefs cannot serve as a neutral foundation for all knowledge. What you perceive depends on what you already believe, creating potential circularity. But if perception delivers raw sense data independent of concepts, it is unclear how these sense data could justify beliefs which have conceptual content. Contemporary epistemology has increasingly integrated insights from psychology and neuroscience. We now know that perception is not a passive recording of stimuli, but an active construction by the brain. Perceptual systems fill in gaps, make inferences, and impose structure. You do not perceive raw sense data, but meaningful objects and scenes, automatically interpreted by perceptual processes. This fits with intentionalism and challenges sense-datum theories. But it also raises new puzzles. If perception constructs what you experience, how much of what you perceive corresponds to reality? Is colour real or merely a construction of visual systems? Is perceived causation real or merely a psychological projection? These questions blur the line between epistemology, psychology, and metaphysics. The problem of perception illustrates a recurring pattern in epistemology. We start with seemingly simple questions about how we know things. Deeper examination reveals hidden complexity and competing theories. Each theory has merits and faces objections. No consensus emerges. Yet the investigation clarifies the issues, reveals assumptions, and shows what is at stake. Whether perception provides direct access to reality or merely indirect representation matters for skepticism, for the structure of knowledge, for scientific realism, and for our understanding of consciousness itself. The problem of perception is not a narrow technical puzzle, but a gateway to fundamental questions about mind, world, and knowledge. Part 8. Social Epistemology, Knowledge Beyond the Individual. Traditional epistemology focuses on the individual knower in isolation. A lone mind confronts the world, gathers evidence, forms beliefs, and tries to acquire knowledge. But this picture is radically incomplete. Nearly everything you claim to know comes not from your own observations and reasoning, but from other people. You know your birth date because others told you. You know about history, geography, science, and current events through testimony. Even your perceptual beliefs depend on concepts and categories learned from your linguistic community. Knowledge is fundamentally social. This realization has generated social epistemology, which investigates how social interactions, institutions, and structures affect knowledge. Social epistemology asks, how should we evaluate testimony? What happens when experts disagree? Can groups have knowledge that individual members lack? How do social biases distort belief formation? These questions are not peripheral to epistemology, but central to understanding how knowledge actually works in human communities. The most basic question in social epistemology concerns testimony. When someone tells you something, should you believe them? Under what conditions does testimony provide justified belief or knowledge? This might seem trivial, but it raises deep puzzles. One approach, called reductionism about testimony, holds that testimonial beliefs are justified only when you have independent evidence that the testifier is reliable. Before believing what someone tells you, you should have reasons to think they are trustworthy, knowledgeable, and honest. You acquire these reasons through observation of past reliability, inference from circumstances, or background knowledge about human reliability. David Hume defended reductionism. He argued that children learn through repeated experience that testimony is generally reliable. This inductive base allows adults to rely on testimony, but the justification ultimately traces back to individual observations. You are not justified in believing testimony as such, only in believing testimony from sources you have independent reason to trust. Reductionism faces a serious problem. It seems too demanding. You believe countless things based on testimony without independently verifying the testifier's reliability. You believe weather reports, news stories, scientific claims, historical narratives. You do not check each source individually. If reductionism is correct, most of your testimonial beliefs are unjustified. This seems wrong. Surely you can gain knowledge from reliable testimony even without independently checking reliability. Anti-reductionism, defended by Thomas Reid and contemporary philosophers like C.A.J. Cody holds that testimony is a basic source of justified belief. You are entitled to believe testimony by default without needing independent evidence of reliability. Of course, you should reject testimony when you have specific reasons for doubt, but absent defeaters, testimony provides immediate justification. This position respects actual epistemic practice. We do trust testimony by default. Children believe what adults tell them before they have evidence of reliability. Scientists accept reports from other scientists without personally verifying every claim. This trust makes human knowledge possible. Without it, each generation would need to rediscover everything for itself. But anti-reductionism faces its own challenge. It seems too permissive. Should you really believe everything you are told, unless you have specific reasons to doubt? This would make you vulnerable to misinformation, propaganda, and honest mistakes. Some discrimination seems necessary. Contemporary epistemologists seek middle positions. Perhaps you need some positive reasons to trust testimony, but not full verification of reliability. Perhaps different contexts demand different levels of scrutiny. Testimony from close friends requires less checking than testimony from strangers. Testimony about mundane matters requires less verification than testimony about extraordinary claims. The question becomes more complex when experts disagree. Suppose you want to know whether a particular medical treatment works. You consult experts, but they disagree. Some experts say the treatment is effective, others say it is ineffective or harmful. What should you believe? You are not yourself an expert, so you cannot evaluate the evidence directly. You must somehow decide which experts to trust. This is the problem of peer disagreement. When equally qualified experts examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions, how should non-experts respond? And how should the experts themselves respond to discovering their peers disagree? One response is to suspend judgment. If experts disagree, and you have no independent way to adjudicate, you should remain agnostic. But this seems impractical. Many important decisions depend on expert opinion. You cannot simply suspend judgment about medical treatments, climate change, economic policy, or legal questions. You must act, and action requires belief. Another response appeals to higher-order evidence. You form beliefs about which experts are more reliable by looking at their track records, credentials, potential biases, and reasoning quality. This is rational, but difficult. Assessing expert reliability requires some expertise itself, and in contentious domains, different communities recognize different experts as authoritative. The problem deepens when we recognize that peer disagreement occurs not just between experts and non-experts, but among experts themselves. When an expert discovers that other respected experts disagree with her conclusion, should she revise her belief? One position, called the equal weight view, says she should give equal weight to her peers' opinions and her own. If half of experts believe one thing and half believe another, she should be 50% confident in each position. But this seems to disrespect your own reasoning. You examined the evidence carefully and reached a conclusion. Why should you abandon your conclusion just because others disagree? Perhaps they made mistakes you did not make. The steadfast view says you should stick to your beliefs if you have carefully examined the evidence, even if peers disagree. Neither position is fully satisfactory. The equal weight view leads to extreme uncertainty whenever there is disagreement. The steadfast view risks overconfidence and dismissing legitimate objections. Real epistemic life requires navigating between these extremes, weighing peer opinion seriously without abandoning your own judgment. Social epistemology also investigates collective knowledge. Can groups know things that no individual member knows? Can a jury know the defendant is guilty even if no individual juror has complete knowledge? Can a scientific community know a theory is correct even though each scientist knows only part of the supporting evidence? Some argue that group knowledge reduces to individual knowledge. A group knows something only if enough individual members know it. Others defend irreducible group knowledge. A group with proper structure and information-sharing mechanisms can have knowledge that transcends individual members' knowledge. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. Consider how science works. No individual scientist knows all the evidence for evolution, plate tectonics, or quantum mechanics. Each scientist specializes in a narrow area. Yet the scientific community collectively knows these theories are correct because knowledge is distributed across many individuals who trust each other's work. This distributed knowledge system produces reliable beliefs that no individual could achieve alone. But collective knowledge faces dangers. Groupthink occurs when group members suppress doubts and conform to group opinion, leading to overconfidence and poor decisions. Information cascades happen when people observe others' choices and follow the crowd, even when private information suggests otherwise. These social dynamics can produce collective error even when individuals have access to correct information. The wisdom of crowds phenomenon shows that aggregating many independent judgments can produce surprisingly accurate results. If you ask many people to estimate the weight of an ox, the average of their estimates will be close to the correct weight, even though most individual estimates are wrong. This works when judgments are independent and diverse. But when people influence each other, independence breaks down and the wisdom of crowds fails. Social epistemology also examines how social structures and power relations affect knowledge. Standpoint epistemology argues that people in different social positions have different epistemic advantages and disadvantages. Those in marginalized positions may perceive certain truths more clearly than those in dominant positions because they experience social realities that dominant groups can ignore. For example, people who experience discrimination may understand its mechanisms better than those who benefit from privilege. Workers may understand workplace exploitation better than managers. This does not mean marginalized perspectives are always correct, but it suggests they provide valuable epistemic resources that dominant perspectives miss. Epistemic injustice occurs when people are wronged specifically in their capacity as knowers. Miranda Fricker distinguishes testimonial injustice, where someone's testimony is not believed due to prejudice, from hermeneutical injustice, where someone lacks the conceptual resources to articulate their experience because their social group has been excluded from generating shared concepts. A woman reporting sexual harassment in an era before the concept existed suffers hermeneutical injustice. She experiences something wrong but lacks the words to name it, because male-dominated discourse has not developed the necessary concepts. A person of color, whose testimony is automatically doubted, suffers testimonial injustice. These injustices are epistemic harms, not merely practical or moral harms. Social epistemology reveals that knowledge is not just about individual minds correctly representing reality. It is about communities sharing information, institutions structuring inquiry, power relations enabling or preventing knowledge, and social practices determining who counts as knowing what. Understanding knowledge requires understanding these social dimensions. This has practical implications. Designing better institutions for knowledge production means understanding how information flows, how trust operates, how disagreement can be productive, and how to prevent social biases from distorting belief formation. Courts, universities, scientific organizations, and democratic institutions all face these challenges. Social epistemology also challenges individualistic assumptions in traditional epistemology. The isolated knower is a fiction. You are born into a linguistic community, taught concepts and categories by others, rely constantly on testimony, and participate in social practices of knowledge production. Your individual beliefs depend on vast social scaffolding. Ignoring this social dimension produces distorted epistemology. Part 9. Applied Epistemology. Knowledge in Practice. Epistemology is not merely abstract theorizing. Questions about knowledge arise constantly in practical contexts that shape human life. Courts must decide what counts as proof beyond reasonable doubt. Scientists must determine when evidence justifies accepting a theory. Doctors must judge when treatments are known to be effective. Religious believers claim to know that God exists. Each domain faces distinctive epistemological challenges. Scientific knowledge provides the clearest case of systematic knowledge production. Science has generated vast bodies of reliable knowledge about the natural world. But what makes science successful? What distinguishes genuine science from pseudoscience? How do scientists actually acquire knowledge? The traditional view, called the hypothetico-deductive method, describes science as a process of forming hypotheses, deriving testable predictions, and testing those predictions through observation and experiment. If predictions are confirmed, the hypothesis gains support. If predictions are falsified, the hypothesis is rejected or revised. Through repeated testing, scientific theories become increasingly well confirmed. But this simple picture faces problems. First, confirmation is not straightforward. Any number of theories can explain the same observations. How do scientists choose among empirically equivalent theories? Second, theories are never tested in isolation. When a prediction fails, you do not know whether the theory is wrong or whether auxiliary assumptions are wrong. This is the Duhem-Quine problem. You can always save a theory by modifying auxiliary assumptions. Karl Popper argued that science does not proceed by confirmation, but by falsification. Scientific theories make risky predictions that could be proven false. Good theories forbid certain observations. When observations contradict predictions, theories are falsified and rejected. Science progresses not by confirming theories, but by eliminating false theories, leaving better theories standing. But falsification faces problems too. Theories are rarely cleanly falsified. Anomalies are common, but scientists do not immediately abandon theories when observations conflict with predictions. They try to explain anomalies, modify auxiliary assumptions, or set anomalies aside as problems to solve later. Popper's philosophy describes an idealized science that does not match actual scientific practice. Thomas Kuhn revolutionized philosophy of science by studying how science actually works. He argued that science proceeds through paradigms, comprehensive frameworks that determine what questions to ask, what methods to use, and what counts as a solution. Normal science operates within a paradigm, solving puzzles and extending the paradigm's application. Revolutionary science occurs when accumulating anomalies create crisis, leading to paradigm shift. Kuhn's most controversial claim is that paradigms are incommensurable. Scientists working in different paradigms literally see the world differently, ask different questions, and use different standards. There is no neutral standpoint from which to compare paradigms rationally. Paradigm shifts are like religious conversions, not rational choices based on evidence. This relativistic picture disturbed many philosophers. If paradigms are incommensurable, science seems irrational. Why think current science is better than past science if we cannot rationally compare them? Kuhn later softened his position, but his work permanently changed philosophy of science by showing that actual science is more complex and less rational than traditional philosophy suggested. Contemporary philosophy of science seeks more nuanced accounts. Lakatos described research programs with hard cores protected from falsification and auxiliary hypotheses that absorb anomalies. Larry Lorden emphasized problem-solving effectiveness as the criterion for theory choice. Philip Kitcher studied the social organization of science, showing how competition and cooperation among scientists produces reliable knowledge. One persistent question is scientific realism. Should we believe that scientific theories describe reality as it is, or are theories merely useful instruments for making predictions? Realists argue that the success of science would be miraculous if theories were not approximately true. Anti-realists respond that past theories were successful yet false, so current success does not guarantee truth. The pessimistic meta-induction notes that most past scientific theories turned out to be false. Newtonian mechanics, phlogiston theory, and the ether were empirically successful but ultimately rejected. If most past theories were false despite success, probably most current theories are false too. We cannot reliably infer truth from empirical success. Realists respond by distinguishing mature, well-confirmed theories from speculative or underdeveloped theories. They argue that central claims of mature theories are retained even when theories are revised. Newton's laws are approximately correct, not completely wrong. Scientific progress preserves successful elements while eliminating errors. This debate matters for how we understand scientific knowledge. If realism is correct, science gives us knowledge of unobservable entities like electrons and quarks. If anti-realism is correct, we should be agnostic about unobservables and treat theories as useful fictions. Legal epistemology faces different challenges. Ortes. Courts must determine facts based on evidence. Did the defendant commit the crime? Did the plaintiff suffer damages? But legal standards differ from scientific standards. Criminal conviction requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. Civil judgments require preponderance of evidence. These are epistemic standards, but they incorporate practical and moral considerations. What is reasonable doubt? Courts cannot demand absolute certainty because that would make conviction impossible. But how much doubt is reasonable? Different people have different risk tolerances. Reasonable doubt is a vague standard that juries must interpret case by case. Legal evidence faces distinctive constraints. Some true evidence is excluded because it was obtained improperly. Hearsay is generally inadmissible, even when reliable. These rules serve legal values like fairness and rights protection, but they sometimes prevent juries from learning relevant truths. Legal epistemology must balance truth-seeking with other values. Expert testimony presents particular challenges. Juries must evaluate scientific or technical claims they do not understand. Courts must determine which experts are qualified and which methods are scientifically valid. The Dober standard requires that expert testimony be based on scientifically valid reasoning, but judges often lack the scientific expertise to make these determinations. This creates a gap between legal judgments about scientific validity and actual scientific consensus. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, yet juries give it great weight. Psychological research shows that memory is reconstructive, suggestible, and often inaccurate. Confident witnesses are not necessarily accurate, yet confident eyewitness testimony is compelling in court. Legal epistemology must incorporate psychological findings about how human cognition actually works, not rely on naive assumptions about memory and perception. Moral knowledge raises deep epistemological puzzles. Do moral facts exist? If so, how do we know them? Moral realists claim that moral truths exist independently of human opinions and that we can have moral knowledge. But how do we access moral truths? We cannot perceive them with our senses. We cannot deduce them from logic alone. Moral intuition seems unreliable given widespread moral disagreement. Moral skeptics argue that moral knowledge is impossible. Moral beliefs merely express emotions or social conventions. There are no moral facts, no. But this seems wrong. It seems genuinely true that torturing innocents for fun is wrong, not merely a matter of opinion. Some philosophers argue for moral particularism. We know particular moral facts through direct perception of situations without needing moral principles. You perceive that this act is cruel, that person is generous, this situation demands help. This moral perception provides knowledge of particular cases, even if we cannot formulate general moral principles. Others defend reflective equilibrium as the method for moral knowledge. We start with particular moral judgments and general principles, both of which seem initially plausible. We adjust judgments and principles until they cohere. Through this reflective process, we achieve justified moral beliefs. But critics question whether coherence alone generates truth. Perhaps a coherent but completely wrong moral system could emerge from reflective equilibrium. Religious epistemology investigates whether religious beliefs can constitute knowledge. Can you know that God exists? Can you know that particular religious doctrines are true? Religious believers claim knowledge, but skeptics doubt these claims can be justified. Classical arguments for God's existence attempt to provide rational proof. The cosmological argument infers God from the existence of the universe. The design argument infers God from apparent design in nature. The ontological argument claims God's existence follows from the concept of God. But each argument faces serious objections, and none has achieved universal acceptance even among philosophers who believe in God. Reformed epistemology, developed by Alvin Plantinga, argues that belief in God can be properly basic, justified without inference from other beliefs. Just as you are justified in believing the external world exists without argument, you are justified in believing God exists if this belief is produced by properly functioning cognitive faculties. Religious experience and a sensus divinitatis produce justified religious beliefs directly. Critics respond that this makes justification too easy. Any belief could claim to be properly basic. What distinguishes genuine proper basicality from unjustified dogmatism? And religious diversity creates problems. If Christians' basic beliefs conflict with Muslims' basic beliefs and both claim proper basicality, how do we adjudicate? Evidentialist religious epistemology requires that religious beliefs be supported by evidence. W.K. Clifford insisted it is wrong to believe anything without sufficient evidence, including religious beliefs. This sets a high bar that many religious beliefs cannot meet. But religious believers respond that evidence is not always necessary for justified belief, and that religious experience provides evidence for those who have it. Practical epistemology extends beyond these specific domains. Every day you make countless judgments about what to believe, who to trust, and how much confidence to place in your beliefs. You decide whether to believe news reports, whether to trust medical advice, whether to accept expert claims about climate change, or economics, or nutrition. These practical decisions require epistemological judgment. One crucial question is how to proportion belief to evidence. Should you believe things with certainty, or should you have degrees of confidence? Bayesian epistemology models belief as having degrees measured as probabilities. You should update your probabilities based on new evidence using Bayes' theorem. This provides a precise mathematical approach to reasoning under uncertainty. But Bayesian epistemology faces challenges. How do you determine initial probabilities? Different starting points lead to different conclusions, even with the same evidence. And real human reasoning does not follow Bayes' theorem. We use heuristics and shortcuts that systematically violate Bayesian principles. Should we try to become more Bayesian, or should epistemology describe how we actually reason? Applied epistemology reveals that knowledge is not just an abstract philosophical concept, but something we need in concrete situations with real stakes. Getting epistemology right matters for justice, for science, for moral deliberation, and for navigating everyday life. Understanding how knowledge works in these domains requires integrating theoretical epistemology with insights from psychology, sociology, law, and the specific practices of different knowledge-producing communities. Part 10. Virtue, Epistemology and Character. So far, we have focused mostly on beliefs. Are they true, justified, constituting knowledge? But epistemology can also focus on persons. Are they reliable, intellectually virtuous, good thinkers? This shift from beliefs to believers generates virtue epistemology, one of the most fruitful contemporary developments in the field. Just as virtue ethics evaluates actions based on whether they manifest virtues like courage, honesty, and compassion, virtue epistemology evaluates beliefs based on whether they result from intellectual virtues like open-mindedness, intellectual courage, carefulness, and fairness. A good belief is one formed by a good epistemic agent exercising intellectual virtue. But what are intellectual virtues? We can distinguish two broad categories. Virtue reliabilism, defended by Ernest Sosa and John Greco, identifies intellectual virtues with reliable cognitive faculties and processes. Perception is a virtue because it reliably produces true beliefs. Good memory is a virtue. Sound reasoning is a virtue. These are virtues in the sense of excellences, stable capacities that tend toward truth. Virtue responsibilism, defended by Linda Zagzebski, Lorraine Code, and others, identifies intellectual virtues with character traits. Intellectual courage is the willingness to examine your beliefs critically, even when this is uncomfortable. Open-mindedness is the willingness to consider viewpoints you initially reject. Intellectual humility is recognizing the limits of your knowledge. These are virtues in the moral sense, requiring effort, cultivation, and choice. These two conceptions generate different epistemologies. Virtue reliabilism is externalist and naturalistic. You have intellectual virtue if your cognitive faculties function reliably, regardless of whether you know they are reliable or make any effort. Virtue responsibilism is internalist and normative. You have intellectual virtue if you cultivate character traits that responsibly pursue truth, regardless of whether these traits are actually reliable in your environment. Why should epistemology focus on virtues rather than beliefs? Several motivations drive virtue epistemology. First, it provides a natural way to handle Gettier problems. Knowledge is not just justified true belief, but true belief arising from intellectual virtue. In Gettier cases, true belief arises from luck rather than virtue, which explains why it is not knowledge. Second, virtue epistemology connects epistemology to ethics, showing that epistemic evaluation and moral evaluation have similar structures. Both concern how persons should be, not just what propositions are true. This unified approach to normativity is theoretically attractive. Third, virtue epistemology focuses on aspects of epistemic life that belief-focused epistemology neglects. We do not just want true beliefs, we want to be good thinkers. We admire people who reason carefully, consider alternatives, admit mistakes, and pursue truth courageously. We criticize people who are intellectually lazy, dogmatic, or cowardly. These evaluations concern character, not just individual beliefs. What are the intellectual virtues? Different virtue epistemologists list different virtues, but some appear on nearly every list. Intellectual humility is recognizing the limits of your knowledge and being willing to admit error. Overconfidence is an epistemic vice. People who cannot say, "I don't know," or "I was wrong," are poor thinkers, even if they happen to be right about particular claims. Intellectual courage is the willingness to examine beliefs that are comfortable or socially approved. It takes courage to question beliefs shared by your community, to examine evidence that might undermine cherished convictions, or to defend unpopular truths. Intellectual cowardice, avoiding uncomfortable truths or challenging questions, is a vice. Open-mindedness is willingness to consider alternative viewpoints and change your mind when evidence warrants. This differs from being gullible or wishy-washy. The open-minded person does not accept every idea uncritically but gives fair consideration to views they initially reject. Close-mindedness, refusing to engage with alternative perspectives, is a vice. Intellectual carefulness is attending to details, checking sources, avoiding hasty conclusions. Careless thinkers overlook important evidence, make reasoning errors, and jump to conclusions. Intellectual thoroughness, the opposite vice, insists on examining every detail endlessly, never reaching conclusions. Both extremes are vicious. Virtue lies in appropriate carefulness given the importance and difficulty of the question. Intellectual honesty is representing evidence and arguments fairly, admitting when objections are strong, not misrepresenting opponents' views. Dishonest thinkers cherry-pick evidence, construct straw men, and hide weaknesses in their positions. Even if they reach true conclusions, their reasoning is vicious. Intellectual autonomy is thinking for yourself rather than blindly accepting authority or following the crowd. This does not mean rejecting all authority or expert opinion, which would be foolish. It means critically evaluating sources and forming your own judgments rather than passively absorbing whatever you're told. But virtues can conflict. Intellectual humility might lead you to defer to experts, while intellectual autonomy urges independent judgment. Carefulness might paralyze you with excessive doubt, while courage pushes you to reach conclusions despite uncertainty. Real intellectual life requires balancing competing virtues, and reasonable people might balance them differently. Virtue epistemology also investigates intellectual vices. Closed-mindedness, dogmatism, arrogance, carelessness, dishonesty, cowardice and conformity are epistemic failures, not just moral failures. A person with these vices will form beliefs poorly, even if some beliefs happen to be true. Some vices are especially pernicious in contemporary information environments. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek and interpret evidence in ways that confirm pre-existing beliefs, systematically distorts reasoning. Motivated reasoning, where desires and emotions drive belief formation rather than evidence, produces biased conclusions. Tribalism, where loyalty to your group determines what you believe, substitutes social identity for truth-seeking. These biases are not just individual failings, but systematic features of human psychology. Overcoming them requires effort and cultivating intellectual virtue. Virtue epistemology provides frameworks for understanding and resisting these distortions. One important question is whether intellectual virtues are value-neutral or value-laden. Are they simply reliable methods for reaching truth, or do they incorporate moral values? Some virtue epistemologists argue that intellectual virtues are purely epistemic, aimed only at truth. Others argue that intellectual virtues necessarily involve moral components. Consider intellectual honesty. Is it a virtue because dishonesty leads to error, or because dishonesty is morally wrong? Perhaps both. Intellectual virtues might be at the intersection of epistemic and moral evaluation, combining truth-seeking with ethical conduct. This raises questions about the unity of virtue. Can you be intellectually virtuous but morally vicious? Can you be morally virtuous but intellectually vicious? Perhaps intellectual and moral virtues are intertwined. Moral reasoning requires intellectual virtue, and intellectual virtue requires moral qualities like honesty and fairness. Virtue epistemology also distinguishes understanding from mere knowledge. You might know isolated facts without understanding how they fit together. Understanding requires grasping connections, seeing how parts relate to wholes, comprehending explanations. Understanding seems more valuable than mere knowledge and requires greater intellectual virtue. For example, you might know that E equals mc squared without understanding relativity theory. You might know historical facts without understanding the causes and patterns that explain them. Understanding requires not just accumulating true beliefs, but organizing them coherently and seeing their significance. Some philosophers argue that understanding is the proper goal of inquiry, more important than knowledge. Science aims for understanding, not just true belief. Education aims for understanding, not just memorization. Intellectual virtue is required for understanding in ways it might not be required for mere knowledge. Virtue epistemology also examines epistemic injustice from a virtue perspective. Failures to give proper credence to someone's testimony or to recognize someone's epistemic authority can stem from intellectual vices like prejudice, arrogance, and closed-mindedness. The privileged often fail to exercise intellectual virtues like humility and open-mindedness when engaging with marginalized perspectives. Correcting epistemic injustice requires cultivating intellectual virtues at both individual and institutional levels. Individuals must develop humility, fairness, and openness. Institutions must be structured to recognize diverse epistemic authorities and resist systematic biases. Critics of virtue epistemology question whether focusing on agents rather than beliefs really provides progress. Perhaps intellectual virtues are just reliable processes by another name, in which case virtue reliabilism reduces to process reliabilism. Or perhaps intellectual virtues presuppose standards for good belief formation, in which case virtue epistemology does not replace traditional epistemology but supplements it. Virtue epistemologists respond that even if virtues reduce to other concepts in some sense, the virtue framework illuminates aspects of epistemic life that other frameworks miss. It connects epistemology to broader questions about human flourishing, provides resources for thinking about education and character development, and captures how we actually evaluate thinkers rather than just beliefs. Virtue epistemology represents a shift from seeing epistemology as purely theoretical to seeing it as also practical. It is not just about what knowledge is, but about how to be a good thinker. This practical dimension connects to education, to intellectual ethics, and to how we structure institutions and practices for inquiry. Part 11. Contemporary Frontiers and Debates. Epistemology continues to evolve, generating new approaches and refining old debates. Several contemporary developments push epistemology in novel directions, connecting it to formal methods, evolutionary theory, and social critique. Formal epistemology applies mathematical and logical tools to epistemic questions. Probability theory models degrees of belief. Decision theory models rational choice under uncertainty. Game theory analyzes strategic interactions among believers. These formal methods make epistemic principles precise and reveal hidden consequences of epistemic norms. Bayesian epistemology, mentioned earlier, is the most developed formal approach. It treats beliefs as having degrees measured as probabilities. You start with prior probabilities over hypotheses. When you receive evidence, you update probabilities using Bayes' theorem. This theorem tells you precisely how much your confidence should change given specific evidence. Bayesianism has elegant features. It provides a principled way to learn from evidence. It shows how to integrate diverse evidence sources. It explains why scientists seek surprising predictions, which provide stronger evidence than expected results. And it unifies much reasoning that seems disparate: inductive inference, hypothesis testing, learning from testimony. But Bayesianism faces challenges. The problem of priors asks where initial probabilities come from. Without evidence, what probability should you assign to a hypothesis? Different priors lead to different posteriors, even with identical evidence. Some Bayesians argue that priors can be anything, and repeated updating will eventually wash out differences. Others seek objective principles for setting priors. The problem of old evidence notes that Bayes' theorem only updates on new evidence. But sometimes we gain confidence in a theory because it explains evidence we already knew. Einstein's general relativity explained Mercury's orbit, which had been observed long before. How does old evidence confirm theories in the Bayesian framework? Various technical solutions have been proposed, but none is universally accepted. Logical omniscience is another problem. Standard probability theory assumes that if you assign probability 1 to a proposition, you assign probability 1 to all its logical consequences. But humans are not logically omniscient. You might assign probability 1 to mathematical axioms without assigning probability 1 to complex theorems you have not proven. Fixing this requires more complicated formal frameworks. Despite these challenges, formal epistemology has generated insights impossible with informal methods. It reveals inconsistencies in intuitive reasoning, shows what rationality requires in complex cases, and connects epistemology to decision theory and economics. Evolutionary epistemology applies evolutionary theory to knowledge. One version treats knowledge as a natural phenomenon shaped by evolution. Our cognitive capacities evolved because they enhance survival and reproduction. Perception, reasoning, memory exist because they helped ancestors survive. This naturalizes epistemology, treating knowledge as a biological adaptation. But what evolution selects for is reproductive success, not truth. False beliefs might be more adaptive than true beliefs in some environments. Overestimating dangers keeps you safe, even if it produces false beliefs about how dangerous things actually are. If evolution does not select for truth, Why trust evolved cognitive faculties? Some evolutionary epistemologists respond that truth and adaptiveness generally coincide. Accurate perception and reasoning usually help survival. So, even though evolution selects for reproduction, it indirectly selects for truth tracking. Others argue that we can reflectively evaluate our cognitive processes and improve them beyond what evolution provided. Another version of evolutionary epistemology applies evolutionary models to the growth of knowledge itself. Scientific theories compete for acceptance. The most successful theories survive and reproduce through teaching and publication. Failed theories go extinct. This treats the history of knowledge as an evolutionary process without requiring biological evolution. But scientific change differs from biological evolution in important ways. Scientific theories are intentionally designed, not randomly mutated. Scientists try to improve theories, not just let them vary blindly. And scientific progress seems directional toward truth, while biological evolution has no inherent direction. The evolutionary metaphor might mislead more than it illuminates. Feminist epistemology critiques traditional epistemology for ignoring how gender shapes knowledge production. Historically, philosophy has been dominated by men, and this shapes what questions are asked, what methods are used, and what counts as knowledge. Feminist epistemologists examine how gender bias distorts epistemology and advocate reforms. One critique targets the ideal of the detached, objective knower. Traditional epistemology pictures a neutral subject examining the world without bias or emotion. Feminist epistemologists argue this ideal is both impossible and undesirable. All knowers are situated, shaped by their social positions and experiences. Pretending to be neutral often masks biases that favor dominant groups. Instead of seeking impossible neutrality, epistemology should acknowledge situatedness and examine how different positions provide different epistemic resources. Standpoint epistemology, discussed earlier, develops this approach. Rather than seeing diversity as an obstacle to objectivity, we should see it as an epistemic resource. Multiple perspectives reveal aspects of reality that single perspectives miss. Another feminist critique targets individualism in epistemology. Traditional epistemology focuses on isolated knowers, ignoring social dimensions of knowledge. But knowledge is produced collectively through cooperation, testimony, and social institutions. Feminist epistemologists emphasize these social dimensions and examine how power relations affect knowledge production. Some feminists also critique the value neutrality of epistemology. Traditional epistemology treats knowledge as value-free, separating facts from values. But this separation is questionable. What questions we ask, what methods we use, what counts as important knowledge, all involve value judgments. Feminist epistemology examines how values shape knowledge and argues for making values explicit rather than pretending they do not exist. Critics worry that feminist epistemology leads to relativism. If knowledge is situated and value-laden, is there any objective truth? Feminist epistemologists respond that acknowledging situatedness and values does not entail relativism. Some perspectives are better than others. We can criticize biased knowledge production while recognizing that all knowledge production involves perspectives and values. Epistemic injustice, developed by Miranda Fricker, is another important contemporary topic. Testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes hearers to give deflated credibility to a speaker's testimony. A woman reporting sexual harassment is not believed because of gender stereotypes. A person of color's testimony about racism is dismissed. These are epistemic wrongs, failures to recognize someone as a knower. Hermeneutical injustice occurs when someone lacks concepts to understand their own experience because their social group has been excluded from generating shared interpretive resources. Before feminists developed concepts like sexual harassment and date rape, women experienced these phenomena but struggled to articulate them. Dominant groups' exclusion of marginalized groups from meaning-making produces hermeneutical injustice. Recognizing epistemic injustice reveals that epistemology is not just about truth and justification, but also about justice and power. Who gets to know? Whose testimony is believed? Who has authority to contribute to shared concepts? These questions are epistemological and political simultaneously. Contemporary epistemology also revisits old questions with new tools. Work on disagreement, mentioned earlier, has exploded in recent years. Philosophers debate what rationality requires when you discover peers disagree with you. This connects to questions about democracy, expert authority, and religious diversity. The value problem asks why knowledge is more valuable than mere true belief. If what matters is having true beliefs, why does it matter whether they constitute knowledge? True belief is valuable because it guides action successfully. But knowledge, which is true belief plus something else, does not guide action better than mere true belief. So, what is the extra value of knowledge? Some philosophers argue that knowledge is valuable as an achievement, like winning a race. Even if winning and merely crossing the finish line both get you across, winning has extra value as an achievement. Others argue that the value problem shows we should focus on other epistemic goods like understanding or wisdom rather than knowledge. These contemporary developments show that epistemology is not a finished project, but an ongoing investigation. New methods, perspectives, and problems continually emerge. Far from being an exhausted field, epistemology remains vibrant and relevant to both theoretical philosophy and practical concerns. Part 12. Where epistemology fails, limits, and ongoing problems. After exploring the vast landscape of epistemology, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Many fundamental problems remain unsolved. Despite centuries of brilliant philosophical work, epistemologists have not reached consensus on basic questions. What is knowledge? How is belief justified? Can skepticism be refuted? These questions stay open, actively debated, without definitive answers. This is not failure in the ordinary sense. Philosophy does not solve problems the way science does. Science progressively builds knowledge, discarding false theories and retaining true ones. Philosophy continually re-examines fundamental questions, finding new depths and complications in problems that seemed simple. Progress in philosophy is not elimination of problems, but deeper understanding of why they are hard. Still, we should honestly assess what epistemology has not accomplished and what obstacles it faces. Some problems might be genuinely insoluble, not just difficult. Understanding the limits of epistemology is itself epistemologically important. The Gettier problem remains unsolved after 60 years. Hundreds of proposed solutions have been offered, each faces counterexamples. Some philosophers have concluded that knowledge is not analyzable, that we should stop seeking necessary and sufficient conditions. Others continue proposing analyses, hoping the next one will work. But perhaps the persistent failure to solve the Gettier problem reveals something deeper. Maybe knowledge is a vague concept without sharp boundaries. Maybe Gettier cases exploit borderline cases where there is no fact of the matter about whether someone knows. Or maybe knowledge is not a natural kind, not a unified phenomenon, but a cluster concept picking out several related but distinct epistemic states. If knowledge is not analyzable, what does epistemology study? We can still investigate sources of knowledge, justification, rationality, even if we cannot define knowledge precisely. We can study particular kinds of knowledge, specific epistemic practices, without having a complete general theory. But this represents a retreat from traditional epistemological ambitions. The problem of the criterion remains unresolved. To know something, we need a criterion for distinguishing knowledge from ignorance. But to trust that criterion, we need to know it is reliable. This requires using the criterion to validate itself, which is circular. Footnote: the Pyrrhonists formulated this problem 2,000 years ago. It is still here. Some philosophers bite the bullet on circularity, arguing that some forms of circularity are acceptable. Others appeal to intuition or common sense to break the circle. Others embrace externalism, denying that we need to know our criteria are reliable. But none of these responses is fully satisfactory. The problem of the criterion continues to challenge any systematic epistemology. Skepticism cannot be conclusively refuted. We examined many anti-skeptical strategies, but none proves decisively that we have knowledge. Maybe this is because skeptical arguments are sound. Or maybe knowledge and certainty come apart. We can have knowledge without absolute certainty, and skeptical arguments only show we lack certainty, not knowledge. But even if we cannot refute skepticism, its force has diminished in contemporary epistemology. Most epistemologists ignore skepticism, focusing on other questions. This might be progress. We recognize that obsessing over skepticism is unproductive. Or it might be evasion. We have given up on a hard problem rather than solving it. The structure of knowledge debate between foundationalism, coherentism, and infinitism remains unresolved. Each position has dedicated defenders. Each faces serious objections. Many epistemologists adopt hybrid positions, but this just relocates the debate to questions about how to combine approaches. Perhaps the debate persists because all three positions capture part of the truth. Some beliefs might be foundational, while others are justified coherently. The structure might vary across domains or contexts, but without clear principles for when to use which approach, this pluralism lacks the theoretical unity that epistemology seeks. The internalism versus externalism debate continues without resolution. Internalists and externalists are talking past each other to some extent, emphasizing different epistemic values. Internalists prioritize rational responsibility and first-person perspective. Externalists prioritize truth connection and naturalizing epistemology. Both values seem important, but they sometimes conflict. Some philosophers seek compromise positions. Perhaps justification requires both internal and external elements. Perhaps different senses of justification exist, some internalist and some externalist, but these compromises feel unsatisfying, more like acknowledging the problem than solving it. The paradoxes mentioned earlier, like the lottery paradox and the preface paradox, reveal tensions in ordinary epistemic reasoning. We cannot consistently maintain all principles that seem intuitively correct. Something must go, but there is no consensus about what. These paradoxes might show that our concept of knowledge is incoherent, requiring revision. Or they might show that knowledge comes in degrees rather than being all or nothing. or they might have solutions we have not found yet. But after decades of work, they remain paradoxes, not solved problems. The value problem challenges why knowledge is more valuable than true belief. If true belief is what guides action successfully, knowledge does not seem to add practical value. Various responses have been proposed, but none is universally accepted. This is troubling because epistemology traditionally assumed knowledge is highly valuable. If we cannot explain why, the entire enterprise looks questionable. Perhaps the value problem arises from focusing too narrowly on individual beliefs. Maybe what is valuable is being a reliable knower, having intellectual virtue, participating in knowledge-producing communities. These go beyond individual beliefs and might better explain what we value about knowledge. Epistemology also faces challenges from cognitive science and psychology. Empirical study of human reasoning reveals that we systematically violate principles that epistemology says are rational. We commit fallacies, maintain contradictory beliefs, reason in biased ways. Are we irrational, or is epistemology's model of rationality wrong? Descriptive research on how we actually reason puts pressure on normative epistemology about how we should reason. If humans cannot follow epistemic norms, are these norms too demanding? Should epistemology lower standards to accommodate human limitations? Or should we see departures from norms as genuine failures? Disagreement between epistemologists themselves is troubling. If experts who have studied knowledge cannot agree about what knowledge is, what hope is there for non-experts? Persistent disagreement among philosophers might suggest that philosophical questions have no objective answers, that they are matters of preference or perspective rather than discoverable truths. But perhaps disagreement is inevitable in philosophy precisely because philosophical questions are the hardest questions. Easy questions get answered and become science or common sense. Philosophy is left with residual questions that resist definitive solutions. Disagreement does not prove there are no right answers, only that finding them is extraordinarily difficult. Another limit concerns the relationship between epistemology and other fields. Epistemology assumes various background views about mind, language, and reality. Different metaphysical assumptions lead to different epistemologies. If we cannot settle metaphysical debates, we cannot settle epistemological debates that depend on them. For example, the question of whether perceptual experience is representational depends partly on the nature of consciousness. The question of whether there are objective epistemic norms depends on metaethics. The question of whether knowledge requires truth depends on the nature of truth itself. Epistemology cannot be completely autonomous. Epistemology also struggles with the problem of application. Abstract epistemological theories often have little to say about concrete cases. When you need to decide whether to believe a news report or trust a medical recommendation, epistemological theories provide limited guidance. The gap between theory and practice suggests epistemology might be too abstract to be genuinely useful. Yet practical epistemology faces the opposite problem. When epistemology engages with concrete practices like science, law, or education, it risks becoming so specific that it loses theoretical unity. A theory of scientific knowledge, legal proof, and religious belief might have little in common. If each domain requires its own epistemology, can there be a general theory of knowledge? Some problems might be genuinely insoluble. The regress problem might have no solution that avoids all objections. Skepticism might be irrefutable. The Gettier problem might show that knowledge is not analyzable. If so, epistemology needs to adjust its ambitions. Instead of seeking complete theories and definitive solutions, it should seek deeper understanding of why problems are hard and what options are available. This is not defeat. Understanding why a problem is hard is itself progress. Clarifying the costs and benefits of different positions helps even if it does not yield consensus. Revealing hidden assumptions and connections enriches our thinking even without solving all problems. Epistemology also has blind spots, areas it has neglected or explored inadequately. The epistemology of creativity, imagination, and hypothesis formation has received little attention compared to justification. The epistemology of aesthetic knowledge, emotional knowledge, and practical wisdom is underdeveloped. The role of luck, timing, and context in knowledge deserves more investigation. Furthermore, epistemology has traditionally focused on propositional knowledge and neglected other epistemic states. Understanding, wisdom, skill, and know-how might be more important in human life than propositional knowledge, yet they receive less philosophical attention. A complete epistemology should cover the full range of human epistemic achievements. The social and political dimensions of knowledge need more attention. Who has epistemic authority? How do power and privilege affect knowledge production? How should institutions be structured to promote knowledge? These questions matter practically, but have only recently become central to epistemology. Looking forward, epistemology faces several challenges. It must integrate empirical findings from psychology and neuroscience without losing its normative dimension. It must address the practical epistemological problems created by information technology, social media, and artificial intelligence. It must engage with diverse philosophical traditions beyond the Western canon, recognizing that epistemology has been developed in many cultures. Epistemology must also respond to political pressures. Claims about fake news, alternative facts, and post-truth discourse raise urgent epistemological questions. How do we maintain shared standards for knowledge in polarized societies? How do we combat misinformation without censorship? How do we restore trust in institutions and expertise? These are not just philosophical puzzles, but practical challenges that epistemology should address. Despite all these problems and limits, epistemology remains essential. We cannot avoid questions about knowledge, justification, and rationality. Every time you decide what to believe, you make implicit epistemological judgments. Understanding these judgments, even imperfectly, is better than not understanding them at all. Epistemology will not end. New generations of philosophers will re-examine old problems, discover new problems, and propose novel solutions. The questions are too important, too difficult, and too fascinating to abandon. Even if complete answers are impossible, the search for understanding continues. What epistemology teaches ultimately is humility. We know less than we think. Our confidence often exceeds our justification. The foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear. Yet we must act, decide, and live based on imperfect knowledge. This tension between our cognitive limitations and our need to know is the permanent condition of human existence. Epistemology helps us navigate this condition with clearer understanding and greater intellectual responsibility. The great achievement of epistemology is not solving all problems, but revealing their depth. Before epistemology, people took knowledge for granted, assuming they understood what they knew and how they knew it. After epistemology, we recognize that knowledge is mysterious, that certainty is rare, that our beliefs rest on assumptions we cannot fully justify. This recognition is not defeat, but enlightenment. Knowing the limits of knowledge is itself a kind of knowledge, hard-won and valuable. So epistemology does not fail by leaving questions open. It succeeds by showing us what we do not understand, by making the familiar strange, by challenging comfortable certainties, and by demanding that we think more carefully about what we claim to know. This is philosophy at its best, not providing easy answers but asking hard questions and forcing us to think deeply about them.